If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description. Additionally, if you would like to request novels and access my Google Drive where I have 200 plus audiobooks, then you can join my Patreon. Link is also provided in the description.
Chapter 41, Leave Rivendell. Aldril POV. What the hell? I muttered, distressed. I didn't understand why my world exploration increased so much. Could it be because I met so many people in these few days? But for it to increase this much must mean they are very important in Middle-earth. From my uncle, great-grandmother, cousin, and Aragorn, I wouldn't doubt it, but does Glorfindel count too? Most likely, yes. Damn it, I should have read the books. I scolded myself for my laziness in not reading the books, but it no longer mattered. Now I had to focus on the rewards. The spatial ring will be very useful and fits well in the Lord of the Rings universe. I once heard a friend say that Sauron created many rings as experiments before making the One Ring. If anyone asks where I got it, I can say it was in the Troll Cave. As for the information I got about the Hawk's Sight ability, it allows me to anticipate others' movements, enabling me to dodge attacks or make precise strikes. It also allows me to see from very long distances and detect traps, clues, or hidden enemies more easily. It's an excellent ability, it will help me a lot in the fight against Smaug. Besides, Glorfindel's advice will help a lot. Possibly in his arrogance, Smaug will consider me a worm not worth his time, and this will help me land a lethal blow from the start. I could also use the signs that witches use. In the acquired memories, there is a sign that allows one to survive a dragon's fire. Aegis of Igni is an advanced ability derived from the Igni sign, which allows the Witcher not only to manipulate fire but also to protect themselves from it. Through this ability, the Witcher can create a temporary magical shield that envelopes and protects them from flames, even the most intense ones, like those of a dragon. This sign came particularly from an ancient Witcher who invented it to face the dragon that killed the woman he loved. Without a doubt, this Witcher was a genius. It's a pity he died along with the dragon. As for the ability of Malenia Blade of Miquella, it would help me a lot. Malenia was one of the best sword wielders in the Elden Ring verse, but the problem is she only uses one sword, and I currently need to learn to use two. This problem has been bothering me these days, so the solution to this problem would be Relaina. I say this because Relaina wields two swords and is one of my favorite bosses from the DLC. I was fortunate enough to have finished it before reincarnating in this world. But losing the opportunity to gain the knowledge of Malenia's swordsmanship would be very painful. What do I do? Can't I get both? Oh great Varda, what should I choose? I murmured while biting my thumbnail. Relaina and Malenia were my favorite bosses in the Souls games, along with Lady Maria, so my indecision is natural. In my moment of indecision, a voice so melodious it could touch the darkest heart, yet so full of power it could bring even the Dark Lord to his knees, whispered to the stars, but clearly I could hear it. Just this once. That's when, without realizing it, my hair shimmered like the starry night, and the system notification went off. I froze for a few seconds. The voice was so majestic that it petrified my body, but at the same time I felt an immense calm. This calmness brought me out of my stupor and, taking a deep breath, I noticed that I was on one knee. His voice alone has this power, how terrifying, I thought to myself. I instinctively knew who had whispered in my mind. This confirmed that the Great Vala were aware of my existence. From what Elrond mentioned, my mother was blessed by the Great Varda, and from what I've read, she is the creator of the stars. Wait a moment. My hair shines like a starry sky on certain occasions, the instinctive bond formed by Shadow Star, and my grandmother being allowed to leave Valinor to care for me. Does this mean the Great Varda has always been watching me? Phew, more unanswered questions, I murmured, holding my forehead. Right, the system notification, I almost missed it. Detected favor from a higher entity, knowledge of Malenia Blade of Miquella and Relaina Twin Moon Knight will be integrated once you sleep. Thank you, Great Varda. Without a doubt, this knowledge of swordsmanship will make me extremely lethal. However, I must not become overconfident. I need to practice, and perhaps in a few months, I can use at least 50% of their effectiveness, which is already a lot. Another notification caught my attention. 3 different sword styles detected. Integration will begin. The new name will be. Meanwhile, in Gandalf's meeting. The meeting continued despite the approaching night, which began to be bathed in moonlight. In the meeting place, Gandalf, Elrond, Saruman, and Galadriel continued discussing what Gandalf had discovered in the ruins of Dol Guldur. Impossible. Sauron should not have a body yet, he should still be a spirit hiding in Mordor. Saruman exclaimed, agitated by Gandalf's revelation, to the point of rising from his seat and slamming his hand on the table. I thought the same, but Radagast informed me that very dark magic was taking place in Dol Guldur, and that's why. Gandalf was abruptly interrupted by Saruman. Don't mention the brown-robed wizard Radagast. He's a fool. He ate too many poisonous mushrooms and lost his mind. He most likely can't tell the difference between dark magic and regular magic. Sighing, Gandalf shook his head. That's why I went to investigate, and in that place, I encountered Sauron and the spirits of the Nazgûl, and here's the proof. Pulling out a cloth from his robe, he placed it on the table and carefully unfolded it. Seeing what Gandalf had revealed, Elrond immediately stood up. Impossible, these are. His words were completed by Galadriel, who gracefully and elegantly approached what Gandalf had shown. Remnants of the Nazgûl. It seems you managed to wound one of them, Mithrandir. Taking the item in her delicate hands, Galadriel felt the lingering traces of dark magic in the helmet. What Gandalf had shown was the helmet of one of the Nazgûl. If Aldril were here, he would notice another change in the plot. If Sauron still lies in Dol Guldur, we must go and defeat him. Right now, he must be in an extremely weakened state, said Galadriel, her beautiful face showing a serious expression. At Galadriel's comment, everyone nodded resolutely. Only Saruman nodded reluctantly, which was clearly observed by Gandalf, increasing his suspicions. At the same time, Aldril had finished organizing everything necessary, packing the soap and some towels the elves had left for his use. It was a pity he didn't have time for a bath. In his storage ring, he stored the drinks from his room, as well as all the fruits the elves had left for him. Putting on his mother's cloak, Aldril checked himself and, seeing nothing was missing, left his room, only to find a nervous Bilbo, who sighed with relief upon seeing him. Aldril, did Keely not tell you why we're leaving so suddenly? And where is Gandalf? Isn't he coming with us? Bilbo was nervous, not understanding why they were suddenly told to prepare to leave. Patting him on the shoulder, Aldril replied, Relax, Bilbo. Gandalf will catch up with us later. Now let's go to the garden, everyone is probably still there. With that said, they both hurried to the garden. With the dwarves. Hurry up, grab the meat, said Bombur, who had packed only food in his backpack. Why are we leaving so suddenly? I haven't been able to sleep well, asked Boffer, as he got up lazily. Hey, where are Aldril and Bilbo? Asked Philly while looking around, only to see a large figure walking alongside a smaller one. Never mind, they're coming. Bilbo and Aldril are here, but where is Gandalf? Asked Gloin. I don't know, why don't you ask Thorin? The team didn't take long to prepare, within minutes, they set off towards the exit. They made a brief stop to gather the horses. There was a small amusing scene as the horses had offered their food as a gift to Shadowstar. Curiously, Bilbo's pony was beside him, implying it was the only one allowed to eat alongside him. Seeing this, Aldril slapped his forehead and sighed, All right, my friend, it's time to go. Upon hearing his companion say they were leaving, Shadowstar neighed joyfully, he had grown tired of being in this place, and there was no mare around to pass the time with. Arriving at the entrance, a group of elven guards stopped them. Thorin, eager to hurry, drew his sword. Out of the way. Seeing the king unsheath his sword, everyone else followed suit and brandished their weapons. The guards viewed this calmly. Despite being only 6 elves, they were confident in dealing with these filthy dwarves. As Thorin glared angrily, a voice stopped him, Wait, Thorin, let me talk to them. Hearing Aldril, Thorin gave him the benefit of the doubt, signaling him to hurry. Approaching the elves, Aldril noticed their demeanor shift from casual to respectful. With a smile, Aldril said, Me Governon, Ion Elrond Neth Aniran Le Thanas Hu Any. Lu Toltho, Aniran and Lena Thrad. Good evening, my uncle Elrond must have informed you who I am. We are in a hurry, so I would kindly ask you to let us pass. May, Bedith Vir, Neth Aldril. The elf respectfully replied, giving the order for the others to let the dwarves through. Thanking him with a nod, Aldril turned to the group, who looked surprised, while Thorin frowned disapprovingly. Let's go, don't waste time. Snapping out of their stupor, all the dwarves nodded and hurriedly left Rivendell. Before leaving, Aldril glanced back at the elf and, with an apologetic smile, said, Hanan Le, Pedo ion nin elrond bane near umabad not hanen, ar udhartha 6 neth I nagram athan bodathon ad. Thank you, tell my uncle Elrond that I apologize for not saying goodbye properly, and that when my journey with the dwarves is over, I will come back. With a nod, the elf went back into Rivendell to deliver the message to Elrond. At that moment, Aldril felt a gaze from the peak of Rivendell. Looking up, he distinguished the silhouette of an elf, whose beauty was evident even from a distance. Already guessing who it was, Aldril smiled, elegantly bowed, then turned around and followed the dwarves. On the peak of Rivendell. With a smile, Galadriel watched Aldril depart. It was indeed surprising that he could feel her gaze from this distance, showing that his latent power was gradually awakening. May the stars guide you, young son of Tindомil. I hope our meeting will be soon, she murmured, then turned around with a charming smile. They have already left. Chapter 42, Resuming the Journey. General POV. Turning around, Galadriel smiled at them. They are gone, she said, before looking up at the moon that began to show its beauty. When she saw Tindомil's son, an emotion she had long suppressed resurfaced with great intensity. Sadness. That powerful emotion she felt upon learning that her daughter had been tortured after being captured by orcs, and that her dear friend had almost succumbed to the wounds inflicted by those orcs. The orcs had taken advantage of Tindомil being weakened by Sauron's black magic and her pregnancy, achieving their goal by making Tindомil leave Middle-earth for Valinor to recover. Moreover, her beloved daughter also left Middle-earth, leaving her alone. The only consolation was that it was only a matter of time before they could reunite once more. This emotion resurfaced upon seeing the son of her dear friend. It was suspected that the child was missing, from the little Tindомil had said after the attack, a white bird, as bright as the stars, had saved young Aldril. She felt immense guilt for not being able to keep Tindомil longer, but the woman, despite her pregnancy and the black magic tormenting her, remained firm in her decision to give birth to her child in Rivendell, her home. Tindомil, sometimes your stubbornness rivaled that of the dwarves, but now you can be at peace. Your son is well, and rest assured, I will care for him in your place, Galadriel promised, ignoring the conversation Elrond and the others were having. However, her thoughts were abruptly interrupted by the sound of Saruman slamming the table. This is unacceptable. Those fools will awaken Smaug, and many lives will be lost due to their stubbornness. Saruman exclaimed, slamming his hand on the table, which barely withstood the blow, as a crack began to spread across it. He had been holding back for a long time, wanting to release his frustration. The decisions made by Gandalf had made him quite unhappy, and the most frustrating part was that Elrond and Galadriel supported Gandalf's decision. Just as Saruman continued to express his great displeasure with the dwarves' expedition to the Lonely Mountain, footsteps were heard approaching the meeting place. Everyone turned their heads when they heard the sound and saw Glorfindel, who calmly made a small, elegant bow to those present. Then, looking at Elrond, he said, Your Highness Elrond, they are gone. Young Aldril said that once he finishes his task with the dwarves, he will return. With an understanding nod, Elrond signalled to dismiss Glorfindel. The latter made another bow, turned, and left. Now focused on the meeting, Galadriel looked at the others and with a serene gaze said, with their departure, their fate is intertwined with all of ours. Much depends on their success or failure. Saruman snorted disdainfully, still upset about allowing the dwarves to continue their journey. That part of Middle-earth's fate depends on a company of dwarves, a half-elf, and an insignificant hobbit. What have we come to? Gandalf, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke with irritation in his voice. He respected Saruman as the leader of the Istari, but it seemed Saruman had forgotten the mission for which they were sent. Do not underestimate the small, Saruman. Within them may lie a strength that even we do not fully comprehend. Sometimes, fate chooses the humblest to accomplish the greatest feats. Remember Tindомil, you thought she was just an impulsive girl, but she ended up being the key to making the dark forces retreat and allowing us these years of peace. Saruman, with a mocking smile, as if Gandalf's words were a joke, stood up, his white robe billowing around him, and in a voice colder than ice, he responded, Let us hope you are right, Gandalf. Otherwise, your decision will cost many lives, and if Sauron has returned, he will seize this opportunity to strike a severe blow to the peace we have maintained. Galadriel, now slightly annoyed, intervened and looked at Saruman with a serious gaze. Wisdom lies in humility, Saruman. Time will tell if your skepticism is justified. For now, we must wait. I am confident that Tindómeal's son will liberate Erebor from that dragon that has given us so much trouble. As the council members continued their discussion, Gandalf sensed a very familiar presence looming along the path Aldril and the others had taken. That presence! How did I not realize it before? The shine of his hair like a starry sky, the immense confidence he instilled in our first meeting, my lady's blessing also extended to Aldril. What role will you play in the fate of Middle-earth, Aldril? Meanwhile, with Aldril and the others, night was falling upon the company as they slowly advanced along a path that would lead them far from the lands of Rivendell. Thorin dared to venture out at night, knowing the orcs wouldn't be foolish enough to enter the land of the elves. As for Aldril, he rode alongside Bilbo's pony. The latter frequently looked back, sighing each time he did so. Come on, Bilbo, you're going to run out of air with all those sighs, Aldril joked, understanding that his little friend still wished to stay in Rivendell. Blushing slightly, Bilbo replied, it's just that Rivendell was so beautiful and safe, and I didn't have time to explore it fully. Aldril nodded. I understand, Bilbo. But after this, we can return and stay for a while. What do you think? That sounds like a great idea, Bilbo said, his mood lifting slightly. Gandalf's absence made him very nervous, but fortunately, he had the presence of his friend Aldril, which calmed him. He didn't want to spend all his time with the dwarves, even though they had accepted him. He was still hesitant to be with them, but maybe in the coming months, Bilbo would develop a sense of friendship with the dwarves. By the way, Aldril, since when do you speak Elvish? Asked Keely, who was riding ahead of Aldril and Bilbo, his question catching the attention of the others. Yes, how do you know Elvish? If it weren't for your ears, I'd swear you were an elf, added Gloin, stroking his beard. Feeling all the dwarves' eyes on him, Aldril chuckled lightly. He even saw Thorin, who was leading the way, tilt his head slightly to listen. After a few moments of silence, Aldril said, to be honest, I think I understand all languages. This clearly surprised them. Thorin, a bit skeptical, said in his language, Fidal, Cool Guzd Huzdal? In that case, can you understand me? Smiling, Aldril replied, Arazark, and also speak it, ... His response cheered all the dwarves, who let out a happy shout of hey. Even Thorin's usually stern face was adorned with a rare smile, clearly pleased. It was extremely rare for a human to understand their language, so whenever they dealt with humans, they had to speak in the common tongue. Surprised, Bilbo whispered, Hey Aldril, is that an ability you have because you're half-elf? His question amused Aldril, who raised an eyebrow and shrugged, responding, who knows, maybe it is. Time passed, and the dwarves occasionally chatted about elven food and wine. Aldril, knowing they were safe for the moment, focused his attention on his system. The school of the wolf style had fused with the sword techniques of Malenia and Relena, resulting in a new name. Skill, Dancing Star - Passive Effect. This sword style is a combination of Malenia, Relena, and the Witcher school of the wolf. The sword style reflects the elegance and lethality of the stars. Your performance in combat will illuminate fallen hearts, giving them strong hope and making them fight with more fervor. This is a great surprise. It has a passive effect that will motivate people in battle. It will be very helpful in the upcoming fights, he thought to himself, excited not only by the passive skill but also because he could replicate the moves of his favorite bosses. He could already imagine replicating Malenia's move, dancing and cutting through enemies like butter. Additionally, the signs he learned from the Witcher's knowledge would keep him well defended. His archery skills had improved exponentially under Sylvanas' guidance. The elven stone his grandmother gave him would accelerate his healing and quickly replenish his stamina, the dark cloak from his mother would hide him from enemies, and his two swords, Anglichel and Anguriel, the strongest swords in Middle-earth, ensured he was ready for anything fate threw at him. It didn't matter if it was a dragon or a balrog, he would face anything in his path. After all, he was the son of Tindómeal, one of the strongest women in history. Nasty orcs. Here you have your chapter, tomorrow I will upload the other one, since this one is too short. Aldril will be in the future the best swordsman, you can imagine the beasts he will face. Remember to support me on Patreon where there are more than 10 chapters ahead of schedule. Chapter 43, Misty Mountains. General POV. Time waited for no one and passed normally, the dark night had gone, giving way to the arrival of the radiant dawn, and the animals began to emerge from their dens. In a forest, the members of the expedition were joking and laughing among themselves. At the front was Thorin Oakenshield, the king of Durinest dwarves. A few hours ago, they had left Rivendell and were now in the forest that marked the border of the Elven territory. Along the way, they encountered some groups of Elven scouts, but with Aldril's intervention, they were allowed to pass without many questions. Thorin's tense face began to relax the further he got from Rivendell. He did not feel comfortable being in Elven territory, and his insecurities grew when he saw how the White Wizard opposed their quest to reclaim Erebor, so he decided to leave at night. The major problem of the expedition, the hidden entrance to Erebor, had been resolved. He was annoyed that Gandalf did not accompany them, as the Grey Wizard had proven to be very resourceful, and along with Aldril, they formed a formidable duo. Thorin even thought that he would not be a match for them together, but there was nothing he could do, he could not give orders to the wizard. Looking at the forest's edge a little further ahead, Thorin turned his head and, with a strong voice that commanded authority, said, "Everyone be alert, we will soon leave Elven territory. Balin, I need you at the front, take out the map and guide us." Nodding, Balin urged his horse to move faster, positioning himself next to Thorin. He took out the map. "We exited from the southeast, so we need to keep the same direction. In a week, we will be reaching the Misty Mountains. I recommend we take the high pass since the Caradhras Pass has terrible weather and would delay us." Nodding at Balin, Thorin looked at the rest of the group. "You heard him, try not to deplete the provisions in a few weeks. This goes for you, Bombur, do not make the same mistake as last month." At Thorin's reminder, everyone looked at Bombur with mocking smiles. He was the main reason the group ran out of food in less than a month. If it weren't for Aldril and Keely hunting, they probably would have starved to death. "If I don't eat, I'll die of hunger," Bombur muttered, lowering his head in embarrassment. Thorin could not understand him, he had a voracious appetite, and if he did not eat, he feared he would go mad. Soon, the expedition team left the forest, completely abandoning the Elven territory. Thorin felt as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He felt that at any moment, the elves would detain them and take the map, ending their journey. As they rode, Bilbo, the curious young hobbit, was whispering to Aldril about what he had learned from Tindомil, but he was still curious about something. "Hey Aldril, you already know who your mother is, but don't you know anything about your father?" At Bilbo's question, Aldril was a bit stunned. Bilbo was right, he had not asked anything about who his father was. However, not wanting to fill his mind with more questions, he gave a vague answer. "The truth is, I forgot, but he must have been a great man to win my mother's heart." "I think the same," Bilbo agreed. With all the accomplishments he knew of Tindомil, not just any man could win her over and much less father her child. In his conversation with Bilbo, Aldril shared part of his childhood and how he was not welcomed by the villagers, leading to his eventual meeting with Gandalf. Like Aldril, Bilbo shared funny anecdotes from his own childhood, such as the time he came home covered in mud, and his mother almost had a breakdown upon seeing him so dirty. Mirkwood. Meanwhile, in the distance in Mirkwood, an extremely beautiful elf was upset, speaking with a blonde-haired elf who exuded elegance. "You have left His Majesty's territory many times, my prince. I don't know what you find attractive about that young human. His Majesty has reprimanded me for not being able to stop you," explained the beautiful elf in a melodious voice, but with slight annoyance in her tone. "You are my best friend, Tauriel, so stop calling me prince." "I don't know, ever since I first saw her, a new feeling has arisen in me. Just seeing her from afar makes me happy, you must understand," responded the elf tiredly. "A month ago, a young woman from Esgarote docked with her father, Bard, at the quay to receive a shipment of wine. From the moment he saw the young woman, he was smitten. Since then, he occasionally went to Esgarote to meet the young human, who was also charmed by the elf's courtship. His behavior clearly annoyed his father, who tasked Tauriel, the captain of the guards, with not allowing his son to leave to see the young human. I know, Legolas, it's just that your behavior has angered the king. Please, spare me your father's reprimands and try to return before your absence is noticed, replied Tauriel with a tired sigh. She could not understand why her best friend Legolas had changed. She did not understand the feeling he had for the young human, and when she asked King Thranduil, he only said that his son should not love a human. Since then, Tauriel had wondered what the feeling of love was and did not know if she would ever feel it. A few weeks later, the expedition team was now at the foot of a mountain range made of rocks. This mountain awakened Aldril's memory, so he quickly reminded the group, "Be careful, from what I read in Rivendell, this place is inhabited by giants." Along with Aldril's words, a rumble sounded in the sky. Rumble. A thunderclap that foretold a storm sounded, alerting all the members of the expedition. Thorin, with a calm face, looked at Aldril. "I already knew, Mr. Aldril, but thank you for the reminder. Besides, I doubt we will encounter the giants, they are usually asleep at this hour." At Thorin's words, everyone else was speechless, and only one thought came to their minds: why on earth did Thorin choose this path? Rumble. Another thunderclap sounded, this time accompanied by dark clouds. Just then, many more thunderclaps echoed in the mountain. Keely, swallowing hard, approached Balin. "Hey Balin, considering the bad weather and the possibility of giants, isn't there a safer route?" Balin looked at the young dwarf and understood Keely's nervousness. The rocky mountains, the storm, and the palpable danger of the giants made the young dwarf nervous, and not only him, but the others were also nervous. Shaking his head, Balin looked at Thorin and then back at Keely. "There is, but it would take us a month to cross." Hearing Balin's words, the others were filled with joy, and when they were about to suggest returning and taking the other path, Thorin's impassive voice sounded. "Durin's day is near, and we cannot afford to lose a month." After Thorin's words, everyone dismissed the idea of taking the other path mentioned by Balin. But this path had another problem they hadn't considered: the horses wouldn't be able to cross it, would be extremely dangerous. This was clearly noticed by Thorin, who dismounted his horse and said, "The horses can't pass through here. It's better to let them go, to return to nature. Take everything necessary." This clearly made Bilbo nervous, who looked at Aldril's indifferent face and nervously said, "Aldril, what do we do?" He knew his friend Aldril was very attached to his horse, and Thorin's command to leave it would surely make him angry. But unlike what Bilbo thought, Aldril dismounted Shadowstar and guided him towards Balin. "Excuse me, Balin, can you lend me the map?" Perplexed by Aldril's request, Balin nodded and handed it to him. Taking it, Aldril opened it alongside Shadowstar and said, "All right, my friend, we may be separated for a while." His words were met with a strong nay from Shadowstar, who didn't want to be separated from Aldril. "I know, my friend, but it's a very dangerous path, and I don't want anything to happen to you. I know you are smart and can understand me. Take all the horses and lead them to Caradhras Pass." Pointing at the map, Aldril showed it to Shadowstar, who neighed in agreement. "Good, after that, go to the Anduin River and then skirt Mirkwood, and finally reach Erebor. I'll be waiting for you there. If you encounter a wizard like Gandalf, he will help you if you ask." With a neigh, Shadowstar looked Aldril in the eyes. Aldril could have sworn he saw Shadowstar eyes clouding, as if about to cry, so he quickly hugged him and said, "We'll only be separated for a while. I trust you. We'll meet again in Erebor, big guy." With that, Aldril petted his horse. This was clearly seen by everyone, who felt very bad but could do nothing. Only a few minutes passed, and the whole group had taken their provisions and left the horses. The horses quickly gathered around Shadowstar, who, with a strong neigh, raised his two front legs and turned around to take the path Aldril had indicated. Looking at his horse in the distance, Aldril took a deep breath and murmured, "May great Varda guide you safely, my dear friend," then turned around to follow the group, trusting that Shadowstar would reach Erebor. After all, he wasn't an ordinary horse. Seeing Aldril's mood, Bilbo quickly patted his arm. "I trust that Shadowstar will arrive safely." At Bilbo's attempt to lift his spirits, Aldril smiled in gratitude and nodded. "I believe so too." Aldril was very upset and berated himself for his idiocy. "Why did I forget this path is not suitable for horses? I should have told them to take the other path from the beginning, and then I wouldn't have to part from Shadowstar. I'm an idiot." Rumble. The sky grew darker, and the thunder became more frequent. The storm was approaching the expedition team very quickly. The group had lasted 3 months, crossed mountains, forests, and rivers, but this path was by far the most dangerous they had encountered. This path was essentially made of rocks. One side was close to the steep rock wall, and the other side was a deep cliff. If someone with a fear of heights crossed this path, they would die of a heart attack. The path's width was only about 40 centimeters, so they had to be extremely careful to step properly, otherwise, they would fall to their deaths. This path was further complicated by the provisions and their weapons they carried. The dwarves' complaints didn't take long to start. Boffer, who was walking slowly with one hand on the wall, looked curiously at the dark abyss and said aloud, "This is definitely the last time I take this path, I swear." Dory, who was walking in front of Boffer, agreed. "I wouldn't mind taking another month to cross the other way. Here I feel like death is whispering in my ear with every step." Dwellin, who was in front of them, spoke with a hint of nervousness in his voice. "Who was the idiot who made a path like this?" Balin, walking at the front, said loudly, "This path formed naturally." The dwarves' conversation was ignored by Aldril, as being the tallest, he had to be more careful than the others. Any misstep and he would fall into the abyss. Things got much worse as the wind started to blow fiercely, and drops began to fall on everyone's faces. "Damn it, it's starting to rain. Be more careful, focus on where you step," shouted Aldril from the back. At that moment, Bilbo, who was more observant, shouted, catching everyone's attention. "What is that?" He wondered, as in the distance, a goat was seen climbing up the steep path. Bombur, seeing a potential prey, shouted with joy, "It's a goat, Aldril, can you shoot it?" This left everyone speechless. They were clearly focused on not falling, but Bombur ignored the danger and asked a foolish question. "Are you stupid? If he shoots, it'll fall," retorted Keely, who was behind Bombur. His brother Philly joined in, "Focus on not falling, Bombur, your fat feet almost take up the entire path's width." Rumble. With a thunderclap, the rain fell like a cascade, drenching all the expedition members, obstructing their vision, and making the path wet and even more dangerous. "Hold on tight and watch your steps," shouted Thorin, who was at the front of the group. This clearly reflected a true leader, as even in battles with the orcs, he was always in front, leading them. As they carefully advanced, a huge shadow covered the group. Dwellin, seeing this, suddenly shouted at the top of his lungs, "Watch out!" An enormous rock, like a falling meteor, came crashing down. Boom! The mountain trembled from the impact. The huge stone crashed at the top of the mountain, causing debris to fall towards the group. "Watch out, hold on tight!" shouted Thorin as he clung with all his strength to the stone wall. Suddenly, not only stones but also gravel began to fall, rolling down from above everyone's heads. In just a few seconds, the path became extremely dangerous. Parts of the trail were affected, with sections collapsing and falling into the abyss. This made everyone shout in surprise. "Damn it! Great all, don't let us fall! That damned rock was thrown by something! Look! Up ahead!" Everyone who had just recovered from the gravel immediately looked in the direction Bilbo was pointing. The thunder's light illuminated an enormous figure moving slowly. It was a massive stone giant that picked up a rock and hurled it toward another giant in the distance. "Damn it! That's a stone giant!" Boffer shouted in horror. As Boffer screamed, the distant stone giant threw another rock, which was heading directly toward the group. "Watch out!" The rock struck the giant's arm, causing it to crumble. The group was lucky that, at the last moment, the stone giant moved forward, blocking the thrown rock with its arm. The battle of the stone giants involved them hurling rocks at each other. This caused the mountain to tremble. All the members of the team huddled against the wall, not daring to move for fear of attracting the giant's attention. "Damn it, and my mother killed several stone giants. How strong was she?" Aldril thought. He was sure that, at some point, these giants wouldn't be a problem for him, but for now, he couldn't face them. One of the stone giants seemed to feel that throwing rocks wasn't as effective, so it slowly advanced until it got close to the other giant and struck it down, causing the mountain to tremble even more. Seeing one of the giants fall, Aldril shouted, "We have to move. Take advantage of them being distracted by fighting." His shout snapped the dwarves out of their stupor, and they moved as quickly as they could. "Hurry, the farther we are from them, the better," shouted Thorin, only to feel the rock beside them tremble and begin to move. This immediately put everyone on high alert. "Hurry!" shouted Balin as the tremor grew stronger, only to be horrified when another stone giant rose, separating the expedition group. The dwarves Keely, Boffer, Bombur, Bifer and Gloin were separated as the path they walked on turned out to be the giant's calf. Thorin, Balin, Aldril, Bilbo and the others could only watch helplessly as the group was divided. The giant that had risen was quickly knocked down by a blow from the other giant, causing it to fall and, by some miracle, the two peaks of the path collided, allowing the separated dwarves to return to the trail. "Quick, jump!" Aldril and Bilbo, being the last, had to jump the gap that had formed. Just as they leaped, another giant joined the battle and, with a rock, blew off the head of the first giant, causing it to crash into the spot where Keely and the others were. This was seen by Thorin, who shouted in desperation, "No!" He thought the rocks had crushed the rest of his group. Rushing as fast as he could to the impact site, he found all the dwarves safe and sound, quickly approaching them. "How are you? How is everyone? Are you injured?" Thorin asked quickly, showing concern for his men. "We're fine, uncle." "Haha, I'll have to tell this to the others." "It's all right, we're all still alive." The dwarves spoke one after another. Thorin, seeing that his group was okay, sighed in relief. As Aldril and Bilbo approached them, the path collapsed, causing Bilbo to nearly fall. He quickly shouted his friend's name. "Aldril!" Aldril reacted swiftly, grabbing Bilbo's hand and, with a strong pull, hoisted him back onto the path. If he had been a second slower, poor Bilbo would have fallen into the abyss. A pale Bilbo appeared before everyone, who didn't take long to make a joke to lighten the mood. "Haha, looks like you soiled yourself, Bilbo," Dwellin said, patting his shoulder. Everyone began to laugh, having narrowly escaped death. As the others laughed, Thorin looked at Bilbo. "Be more careful, Mr. Baggins. We don't want you dying prematurely." Seeing Bilbo nod timidly, Thorin spotted a cave not far from their location. "There's a cave. Let's go inside. It'll be safer there." With a pat on the shoulder, Aldril encouraged Bilbo. "You now have a story to tell when you return, Bilbo." Fortunately, the path was wider, allowing them to walk more comfortably. "Yes, I'll tell everyone how I nearly died in a stone giant attack. They'll surely be very surprised," murmured Bilbo as he followed the others. What Bilbo didn't know was that in his next encounter, he would leave a mark on Gollum. Chapter 44, Trapdoor. General POV. The cave was at the end of the trail, and the expedition team quickly followed Thorin towards it. They were in a hurry to take shelter from the rain and have at least a few seconds of peace. The stone giant's attack had pushed their mentality to the limit, making them feel like they could die at any moment, causing mental exhaustion. Most of them just wanted to sleep to relax their nerves. Thorin cautiously entered the cave. He had experience in this and knew that a beast might be using this cave as a lair. With his elven sword in hand, ready for any attack, he advanced slowly. The cave was quite spacious and too clean, suggesting that no animal used it as a lair. Relaxing his posture a bit, Thorin looked back at the group following him. "It seems safe, but just in case, investigate further. We don't want any surprises while we rest." With Thorin's order, all the dwarves set to work. The only ones who didn't investigate were Aldril and Bilbo. The darkness was not an impediment to Aldril's eyes, it looked like a lit room where there was nothing. For this reason, Aldril reminded Bilbo that it wasn't necessary to search as the cave was clear. While they were arranging their backpacks, Aldril's thoughts drifted to the part of the plot where the team falls into the goblin's trap and gets captured. Activating his Hawkeye ability, Aldril easily observed details that would go unnoticed by others. For him, the line dividing the floor was clearly a trapdoor. He thought of telling the others, but something almost divine warned him that it would trigger tragic events and change the course of the story. That feeling gave him goosebumps, and he decided to abandon the idea of warning the team about the trap. "I don't know where that premonition came from. But if I've learned anything, it's to listen when something inside you says not to do it. Besides, I can use this situation to kill some goblins and earn skill points." Additionally, this part of the plot was crucial for the story. Bilbo Baggins, a simple hobbit, would find the most powerful ring in all of Middle-earth, the One Ring. If Aldril intervened in this event, who knows what tragic future would occur. Maybe Sauron would capture Gollum and obtain the One Ring, thus dooming Middle-earth. After a few minutes, everyone returned and shared what they had seen with Thorin. "There are no traces of any animals," said Gloin as he dropped his backpack and sat down. He was extremely tired, and his mentality was not good. He urgently needed a nap. "Same here, just some pieces of wood," added Philly, who threw the little wood he had found. He brought it because he thought the group would make a campfire. Nodding to Philly, Bomber quickly suggested, "Let's make a fire to heat the food." He quickly dropped his backpack and took out some sausages, eager to relieve his nervousness with delicious food. "Hurry up, let's light the fire," Bomber urged while piling the wood. His hurried action stopped at Thorin's voice, which, although calm, imposed authority. No, the smoke will get trapped in the cave and force us out to breathe, Thorin said, looking at Balin beside him. Balin, take out the dried meat and the wine. Let's eat and rest. We'll leave at dawn. With Thorin's order, everyone began to settle in the cave. While the others got comfortable, Balin took out the meat and wine, then looked at Thorin and said, "We should wait for Gandalf." That was the agreed plan. Shaking his head, Thorin replied, "Plans change." Then he looked at the dwarves and gave more instructions. "Boffer, you'll be the first to keep watch, and Bomber, you'll be the second. Avoid eating our provisions while we sleep," he warned, giving Bomber a serious look. At Thorin's words, Balin hesitated to speak further, finally giving up and shaking his head. He knew that Gandalf's actions in taking them to Rivendell had upset Thorin, but there was no other way. If they hadn't gone to Rivendell, they would probably all be dead now. Moreover, from the beginning, Thorin didn't trust Gandalf much. He respected him, that was clear, but trust was different. In Balin's view, Gandalf's plans had led them on the right path, and he had indirectly helped decipher the map. At least he should have trusted the Grey Wizard a little more. But after all, Thorin was the king of the dwarves of Durin and couldn't go against his decisions unless they posed a great risk, in which case he would only make suggestions to change his decisions. While the team rested, ate, and drank, the storm outside intensified, and the thunder rumbled louder. Hearing the strong winds whistling outside the cave, Bilbo sighed with relief. "I'm glad we found the cave. I wouldn't want to be outside in that storm," he murmured. What the expedition team didn't know was that a group of orcs riding wargs had appeared under the intense rain in the barren lands. In front of them was a pale orc, larger than the common orcs, riding a huge white warg, clearly the alpha of all the present wargs. With a grimace of disdain at the horrible weather and the now broken path, the orc turned around, annoyed, his horrible face visible by the flashes of thunder in the sky. His scarred face contrasted with his mouth full of sharp, disordered teeth. The upper part of his body was bare, revealing various scars, but one in particular stood out among the rest, a large scar running diagonally from his collarbone to his waist. Additionally, he was missing a hand, replaced by a sword adapted to his arm. The alpha warg sniffed the ground and growled, giving all the answers the pale orc wanted. With a grin, he shouted in a deep voice, "The stench of those filthy dwarves hasn't dissipated yet. They've crossed the mountain. Pass my orders and increase the bounty on their heads." "Yes, sir," said one of the following orcs respectfully, quickly writing something in a strange language and placing the note on a raven, which immediately took flight. "Let's go." "They can't be far," the pale orc urged his warg to move forward with one last look at the storm. He was ecstatic, getting closer to his prey, and for some reason, his biggest scar burned as if remembering the blade that had cut him. The expedition team in the cave was unaware that the orcs had already caught up to them. They were chewing the meat and drinking the wine the elves had given them, unconcerned about what was happening outside the cave. They were very happy, having almost emptied the elves' wine reserves. They would have wine for about a month and a half if they managed it well, but with their behavior, the wine would last only a few weeks. Unlike the dwarves, Aldril was drying his head with a towel taken from his storage ring. Fortunately, his mother's cloak hadn't gotten wet. He didn't know what material it was made of, but he was grateful it didn't get soaked. With a sigh, Aldril leaned against the cave wall and took a piece of elven bread from his reserves, chewing it. Unlike the others, he wasn't mentally tired, all thanks to his increased attributes. Additionally, the drink his uncle Elrond had given him was miraculous. He called it Imladris, and a small sip of this drink warmed his cold, rain-soaked body and revived his energy to the maximum. He was curious about how the elves made this drink and would investigate it upon his return to Rivendell. It didn't take long for everyone to finish eating, and due to mental exhaustion, they weren't in the mood to stay awake. In just a few minutes, a symphony of snores filled the cave. Aldril, aware that the trapdoor would soon open, got up and moved towards the cave entrance. This was clearly seen by Bilbo, who couldn't sleep. Seeing Aldril move, he quickly got up and followed him. "Can't sleep?" Aldril asked. "No, and it seems neither can you," Bilbo replied, positioning himself on the other side and looking at the strong storm brewing. With growing doubt, Bilbo asked, "Do you think Gandalf will catch up to us?" Stopping his gaze at the storm, Aldril focused on Bilbo and gave him a reassuring smile. "Of course, it's only a matter of time before he catches up." Receiving Aldril's response, Bilbo nodded. He feared they would leave Gandalf behind, as Bilbo considered him a good friend. "Hey, Aldril, could you?" Bilbo's words got stuck in his throat as both his sword and Aldril's began to glow. Both, aware of what this meant, looked at the sleeping dwarves, who were snoring even louder. Aldril observed as the small but imperceptible line dividing the trapdoor began to open. Focusing his attention on this, he couldn't stop Bilbo, who had already run towards the dwarves and was shouting. "Wake up!" Bilbo's shout had the desired effect, as all the dwarves quickly got up. "What's going on?" shouted Thorin, the quickest to rise, looking seriously at Bilbo. "What happened?" an agitated Dwellin asked. Seeing the awake dwarves, Bilbo was about to speak, but before he could, a creaking sound was heard in the cave, and with it, the ground began to fall, taking everyone with it. "Damn it! What's happening?" a desperate Gloin shouted, but his words were left hanging as he quickly fell into the trapdoor with everyone else. Aldril saw this and sighed with weariness, as he also saw Bilbo fall with the dwarves. But he wasn't worried about him. It was most likely that, as in the plot, Bilbo would be safe and then fall to meet Gollum. "And here we go." With another sigh, Aldril drew Angwyrel from its sheath and calmly threw himself into the trapdoor. Chapter 45, Kingdom of the Goblins. General POV. As Aldril descended through the trapdoor, he wedged his sword between the sand and gravel, slowing his descent. Angwyrel demonstrated its sharpness by slicing through the gravel as if it were paper. It was known as one of the strongest swords in Middle-earth for a reason. He chose not to use a dagger, fearing it wouldn't support his weight. The echoes of screams could still be heard, indicating a long fall ahead. Aldril realized the shaft wasn't straight down a safety measure, otherwise all team members would have perished. This path was more like a slide, one could walk on its surface with caution. Straightening up, Aldril cautiously walked while the dwarves slid due to inertia, unable to stop. With each step, Angwyrel shimmered brighter, signaling approaching enemies. Aldril calmly continued, walking where possible, sliding and using his sword to cushion his falls when necessary. Upon reaching a steeper decline, Aldril heard constant exclamations, curses, growls, and the sounds of a fight, a clear sign the dwarves had been captured by goblins. Determined, he hastened his descent. As he slid, he could hear the goblins cheerfully shouting. "Fresh meat! These guys are really ugly, uglier than us. What did you expect? They're dwarves and uglier than us. I heard dwarves have thick, juicy flesh and a very strong flavor. Did you see that fat dwarf? He must be delicious." The goblins were clearly delighted. Food was scarce in the Misty Mountains, and they rarely had the chance to eat a human or dwarf, imagining how tasty it would be. Oblivious to the goblins' imaginings, the dwarves shouted angrily. "Let me go, filthy goblin! If I break free, I'll kill you all!" The dwarves were clearly bewildered. Moments ago, they had been enjoying a pleasant sleep only to find themselves falling and quickly captured upon landing. This infuriated and panicked them, feeling disheartened as they were disarmed within seconds. The trap site was nearly deserted as the other goblins joyfully presented their catch to the Goblin King. One goblin stayed behind, inspecting the packs that had fallen with the dwarves. Suddenly, a stone rolled down the trap hole, catching the goblin's curiosity. As he approached, Aldril descended, swiftly impaling the goblin with his sword through the head. Calmly withdrawing his sword from the goblin's head, Aldril quickly scanned the area, spotting two more goblins glaring at him angrily. Moments ago, one of their own had fallen off the cliff with the smallest dwarf, and now a man killed one of theirs while falling through the trapdoor. "So they've taken the others already," murmured Aldril, surveying the mostly empty area. Focusing on the goblins who glared at him with hatred, Aldril smiled and taunted, "What are you waiting for?" His mockery further provoked them. The two goblins rushed to kill this human who dared to mock them. With a roar, the two goblins lunged at Aldril with their rusty swords. It was clear they had poor equipment and fought carelessly. To Aldril, these goblins were like children with sticks, trying to hit him. With a vertical motion, Aldril decapitated the goblin who had jumped to attack him, a foolish move that cost the goblin his life. The other, seeing how easily his companion had been killed, turned and fled to seek help. However, Aldril swiftly closed the distance with the fleeing goblin, seized him by the head, and effortlessly tossed him upwards. With a swift upward thrust of his sword, he impaled the goblin through the stomach, causing him to die. "Malenia's moves are definitely my favorite," murmured Aldril as he moved his sword to remove the impaled goblin's body. The current movement was one used by Malenia to impale the soot, one of her deadliest moves that easily took away more than half of life. Now what do I do? Do I wait for Gandalf to appear? Yes, it will be better to wait. Gandalf's incorporation will increase the chance of us leaving with Vida from this place. As for Bilbo, the most likely is that right now it is under, meeting Gollum, murmured. Aldril, who crossed his arms, was relaxed, since his instincts told him that no goblins were around. For the moment, let's see the show. Walking towards the bridge, Aldril stopped for a moment. Right, the supplies, it is better to save them. Returning, Aldril used his storage ring and placed all the backpacks within. This action would make the trip of the dwarves more bearable, since, in the original plot, having left their supplies, it would cause them to suffer from hunger and thirst. Carefully walking across the hanging bridges, Aldril observed that the underground realm of the goblins was vast and labyrinthine. The hanging bridges, built in a way, stretched in all directions connected to dark caves, creating a maze of unstable paths that challenged anyone who tried to cross them. With each step he took, the bridge ominously creaked, the wooden planks creaked under its weight, threatening to break at any moment and precipitate it into the dark abyss that opened below. Flickering torches that barely managed to illuminate small fragments of the path would make anyone who did not know the way run a huge risk of falling into the abyss below. However, this was not a hindrance to Aldril, who, thanks to his vision, could see through the cold darkness. In the distance, with his piercing gaze, he distinguished a crowd of goblins marching towards a raised platform. So they're there, he murmured to himself. He accelerated his pace regardless of the fact that the wood creaked even more. As he approached the platform, the sounds became clearer and he could hear a furious Gloin grumbling and cursing at the goblins. Damn monsters, I'm going to kill them. Shaking his head, Aldril remembered that Gimli in the movies was just like his father when it came to insults and competition. Like father, like son, he thought, while continuing to cautiously advance down the narrow cave corridor. The sound of a fight echoed from below, catching his attention. Peering carefully over the edge of the precipice, Aldril was surprised to see Bilbo engaged in a duel with a goblin. Shouldn't he have fallen? He said to himself, recalling the sequence of events. He drew his bow, determined to aid Bilbo from his elevated position. However, just as he pulled the string taut and aimed, his eyes widened in shock as he witnessed Bilbo, along with the two goblins, tumble into the dark abyss. Aldril's heart skipped a beat. No. He whispered hoarsely, unable to process what had just happened. Taking a deep breath, Aldril reminded himself that Bilbo would be fine. Trust in fate, Bilbo will not die, he reassured himself, trying to calm down. Gathering himself, Aldril continued moving toward the brightly lit platform, surrounded by many torches and growls, a clear indication it was where the dwarves were being taken. As Aldril approached the platform, illuminated by countless torches casting light into every corner, he saw deformed goblins and dwarves milling about. The platform was perched atop a rocky pinnacle, with bridges around it that were broader and wider. Atop the structure sat an enormous throne, adorned with gold and multicolored gems. Seated upon it was a giant goblin at least 4 meters tall, his deformed body covered in boils and grotesquely obese enough to repulse anyone who saw him. In his hand rested a staff adorned with a sheep's skull, and a crown adorned his bald head. This repugnant creature was the Goblin King. The Goblin King watched with glee as his goblins brought in the dwarves. He would have a good feast today. In his joy, he attempted to rise, but his obese body hindered him. The goblins, mindful of their king's condition, quickly assisted him to stand, inadvertently crushing one in the process. Seeing their king rise, the goblins around him tacitly understood and began to play various drums, iron pans, and other instruments, creating music. Their king was so delighted that he decided to sing. Clap. Snap. The black crack. Grip. Grab. Pinch. Nab. And down to Goblin Town. You go, my lad. Clash. Crash. Crush. Smash. Hammer and tongs. Knocker and gongs. Pound. Pound. Far underground. Ho. Ho, my lad. Swish. Smack. Whip crack. Batter and beat. Yammer and bleat. Work. Work. Nor dare to shirk. While goblins quaff, and goblins laugh. Round and round far underground. Below, my lad. The sound of the goblins' voices was so discordant and terrifying that it ominously resonated on the walls of the cave. Thorin and his company found themselves desperately covering their ears, facing the most off-key and disturbing voices they had ever heard. Around them, a chorus of goblins fervently repeated the great goblin's song with twisted joy. The same words and melody echoed again and again, increasing the tension in the air fraught with malice and danger. After the lyrics were sung a second time, the great goblin spun around theatrically, raising his staff high with a triumphant shrill cry, "Yes!" His voice echoed through the cave, silencing the other goblins. Meanwhile, a fight was taking place in the abyss, a hobbit with a sword facing off against a creature that seemed to be a goblin. "I told you, just one more riddle," Bilbo said as he took his stance. The creature he faced was dangerous, he saw how it killed and ate one of the goblins that had fallen. With a growl, Gollum stealthily picked up a stone, ready to kill this person. Rarely did goblins fall that he could eat, and now he was lucky that 2 goblins had fallen alongside a hobbit. "Grr, then tell us," Gollum growled, but seeing that the hobbit didn't respond, he shouted, "Tell us." He was trying to distract this hobbit, but he was always vigilant of his movements, not letting him slip away to take him by surprise. "I'm coming, just give me a moment," Bilbo said, staying silent for a few seconds. He reached into his pocket and, opening his eyes to a nearly impossible riddle, asked, "What have I got in my pocket?" Frustrated by Bilbo's words, Gollum threw a tantrum. "That's not fair. It's not fair. It's against the rules," he shouted, hurling a stone in frustration. "I want another riddle," he growled. "No, I said it was the last one." "What's in my pocket?" Bilbo replied, keeping his sword pointed at the creature in front of him. If he remembered anything from Aldril's lessons, it was to always be alert and not be distracted. Hearing Bilbo's reply, Gollum became agitated and leaped towards Bilbo, but the sword prevented him. "3 chances. You have to give us 3 chances." "Very well, 3 chances, go ahead." Smiling at the hobbit's acceptance, Gollum thought for a moment and then joyfully exclaimed, "Hands, they're hands." Showing his left hand, Bilbo shook his head. "No, they're not hands." Gollum became desperate and started moving around frantically, throwing bones from his old prey. "Grr, fish, goblin teeth, bats," he muttered quickly. "A knife!" he shouted. "No. You only have 1 chance left." In a desperate act, Gollum pointed at Bilbo. "A fairy." Bilbo denied it. "No, you've lost all 3 chances." Upon Bilbo's reply, Gollum became desperate, put his hands to his head, and curled up in a fetal position, lamenting. Bilbo didn't mind the creature's behavior and said, "You lost, let's go. You said you'd help me find the way out." As if a second personality took over Gollum, he slowly stood up, repeating, "Did we lose? Did we really lose?" And with a twisted smile, he reached into his loincloth, only to open his eyes in desperation and search everywhere. Where is it? Where is it?" Hitting the water, Gollum became even more desperate. "No! No! No! My precious! It's lost! What did you lose?" Bilbo nervously asked, bewildered by the creature's behavior. "Don't ask, it's none of your concern." Crying, Gollum put his hands to his head, repeating his characteristic phrase, "Gollum! Gollum!" Defeated, he looked at his reflection in the water and as if he had discovered something, his face twisted with anger. "What have you got in your nasty little pockets?" Hearing the creature's words, Bilbo tensed. He instinctively knew the creature was looking for the ring he had tucked away in his pocket, so with determination, he aimed his sword at Gollum. Noticing the hobbit's movements, Gollum's face hardened, and through gritted teeth he said, "You stole it. You have it." With a shout, he lunged at Bilbo, ready to kill and reclaim his precious. However, Aldril's appearance made a significant change in the story. In the original movie plot, Bilbo would have run away, but this time, he didn't. Nervous but determined, he wielded his sword. Gollum didn't expect this, so being in the air, he couldn't dodge it. The sword cut a diagonal line across Gollum's face, causing him immense pain. "Ah!" he screamed in agony, writhing. Bilbo seized the moment and ran away. He was nervous, for some reason, he didn't want to kill this creature, but that didn't stop him from protecting himself. He left an indelible mark on Gollum, a mark that would follow him for the rest of his life. Chapter 46, Escape from the Goblin Kingdom. General POV. Dwarves. The dwarves were not having a good time. The horrible singing of the goblins was extremely annoying, especially for Balin, who had the most sensitive hearing and felt he was enduring the worst possible torture. "That is not a song, it's just screams that scrape the eardrum," he shouted as he covered his ears with his hands, trying to muffle the sound. I'd rather listen to bombers snoring 1,000 times over these goblin chants, added Boffer. Like Balin, he wasn't having a good time either, but he could still cope with the situation since his hearing wasn't as sensitive. Ignoring the dwarves' complaints, the Goblin King slumped his obese body into his seat and made a gesture with his hand. The goblins, understanding their king's signal, quickly threw down all the weapons they had taken from the dwarves. Looking at the weapons his goblins had thrown, the Goblin King, in a surprising act, managed to stand up unaided due to his astonishment. His previously indifferent face turned fierce, and he shouted loudly, his saliva splattering the goblins below him. "Who dares to intrude into my kingdom fully armed? Thieves? Spies? Or perhaps assassins?" Staring down, the Goblin King couldn't identify the dwarves, as they were of the same height as the goblins and, with so many crowded together, the dwarves blended in. Seeing this, one of the goblins at the front stepped forward with a cheerful expression and said, "They're dwarves, your majesty, they fell into the trapdoor." Hearing one of his goblins speak, the Goblin King wondered to himself, "Dwarves?" His expression quickly changed, and he ordered, "Search them. I want everything they have on them." At their king's command, the goblins, with the skill of a thief, inspected the dwarves. One of them took a hidden bag from the dwarf Ori. Feeling its weight, the goblin smiled gleefully and dumped everything out. Immediately, an assortment of spoons, wine glasses, candle holders, and other items appeared. Some goblins who saw this fell silent, unable to comprehend how such a small bag could hold so many things. Was this dwarf a wizard? Even the dwarves looked at Ori in surprise, as everything clearly belonged to the elves, but it was surprising that Ori had stored so many things in a small bag. Feeling the stares of his companions, Ori felt a bit embarrassed and said, "I took them as souvenirs." Even the Goblin King was a bit puzzled and blinked several times before remembering what he wanted to ask. "Tell me, what brings you to my territory?" Despite being unarmed and surrounded by goblins, the dwarves showed their proud demeanor and remained silent in response to the Goblin King's question. They weren't foolish enough to say they were headed to Erebor. This attitude greatly annoyed the Goblin King, who, with a hint of irritation in his voice, looked around and shouted, "If you don't want to talk, we'll make you talk. Bring the bone breaker, bring the meat grinder." Mockingly, he pointed at Ori. "We'll start with the youngest." He identified Ori as the youngest because he had the shortest beard. A beard was a clear indicator of a dwarf's age. The older they were, the longer their beard would be. It was also easy to identify royalty, as their beards were usually thicker and better groomed than those of common dwarves. Seeing that the Goblin King was about to torture him, Thorin Oakenshield, who was hidden among the crowd, finally couldn't bear it any longer. "Wait!" A sharp shout echoed through the surrounding caves. Tired of the situation, Thorin shouted, calmly pushed aside a goblin that was in his way, and emerged from the crowd with the elegance of a king. With his head held high, he faced the Goblin King. "Well, well, well! Look who's here!" The Goblin King instantly recognized Thorin, and his eyes lit up with amusement. He couldn't resist making sarcastic comments to mock Thorin. It turns out to be Thorin, son of Thrain, grandson of Thror, the king under the mountain. With exaggerated movements, the Goblin King made a mocking bow. "Oh, I forgot, you no longer have the mountain, so you're no longer a king, which makes you a nobody." These taunts hurt Thorin's pride, but as a king, he demonstrated his strength and, without any change in his expression, looked the Goblin King in the eye, unconsciously conveying that the taunts wouldn't affect him. The Goblin King was not pleased with Thorin's lack of reaction, so a quick idea came to his mind, and he smiled mockingly. Raising a finger as if he remembered something, he said, "Suddenly, I remembered, someone offered a great reward for your head." The Goblin King slowly straightened up and continued, "Perhaps you know who I'm talking about." His question was met with Thorin's indifferent face, who believed the goblin was merely babbling, but the following words caused a change in his expression. "You already know him, a pale old orc. What was his name?" "Oh yes. The Goblin King didn't finish speaking, as a roaring Thorin responded, "Azog is dead. He died in our battle long ago." Clearly, the Goblin King touched a sensitive nerve, as talking about Azog brought back memories of his grandfather's death and many of his people. For Thorin, speaking of that vile orc was taboo. Pleased to have riled Thorin, the Goblin King continued, "So, you think he's dead?" Stroking his enormous, boil-covered jowl, the Goblin King looked up and gave orders to a small goblin in a bucket attached to a rope. "Send a message to the orc. Tell him we have the person he wants." Meanwhile, a goblin was innocently inspecting the dwarves' weapons when, at one moment, he drew Thorin's sword. The sword vibrated with its own will, causing the goblin to scream, as he felt as if his spirit was being cut. With a quick motion, he threw the sword, which landed at the feet of the Goblin King. The Goblin King felt his spirit being cut and instinctively looked down. Seeing the sword and feeling its vibration, he was so frightened that he took a step back and fell on his backside. Seeing their king fall, the goblins quickly ran to help him up, but before they could, the Goblin King pointed at the sword with trembling fingers, stuttering, "I recognize that sword. That sword. The biter. The one that has cut thousands of goblin necks." Understanding that it was the dwarves' fault their king was so upset, the goblins began to beat them. Clearly, the dwarves wouldn't let themselves be beaten and started to fight back despite being bound. "Kill them! Don't leave any alive! Cut off their heads!" roared the Goblin King. At his command, the goblins attacked with more ferocity. Thorin, who was bound, was quickly surrounded. The goblins, being the majority, overwhelmed him and managed to knock him to the ground. A goblin climbed on top of him, drew a bone dagger, and with a triumphant smile, prepared to stab Thorin. Sheesh! However, an arrow pierced through the crowd, the tip embedding in the goblin's head, causing his movements to halt abruptly. The dagger he held fell, and the goblins holding Thorin were stunned, wondering where the arrow came from. Their question was answered when they saw a human killing their comrades while advancing across the bridge. With Aldril. Aldril had taken advantage of his mother's cloak, which hid him in the darkness. The goblins passing by him didn't notice. At first, he observed the scene, slightly different from what he saw in the movie, but when he realized Gandalf wasn't appearing, he decided to save Thorin, who was about to be killed. He was prepared for plot changes, so he wasn't too surprised that Gandalf didn't appear in time. Drawing his elven bow, a gift from Glorfindel, he placed an arrow on the string, drew it back, predicted the goblin's movements in seconds, and fired the arrow forcefully. It traveled through the crowd until the tip lodged in the head of the goblin threatening Thorin. With Thorin saved, he sheathed his bow and drew Anglichel and Anguriel. His movement caught the attention of nearby goblins, who noticed him due to his motion and with a roar of indignation, charged at him. However, to the goblins' horror, Aldril's swords vibrated, causing them to feel extreme terror, immobilizing them. Taking advantage of their paralysis, Aldril cut them down with a sword dance, each movement a work of art. With his left hand, he executed a diagonal slash, effortlessly cutting through the goblins. With his right hand, he coordinated his attack and made a horizontal slash, decapitating 5 goblins. Elegant and swift movements resulted in most of the goblins dying and falling off the bridge. Aldril advanced with concentration toward the expedition team, unsure when Gandalf would appear, so he decided to help the dwarves until the old wizard showed up. Quickly clearing his path, more than a dozen goblins fell under his blade. The remaining goblins retreated, terrified by how easily the human killed their comrades. The Goblin King, seeing this, was enraged and shouted, "Don't retreat! Kill him!" He wouldn't lie, this human induced a primal fear in him, but it was Aldril's sword Angwirel that caught his attention. The gleam of that sword caused his entire body to tremble with fear. Noticing that Aldril was slowly approaching, he shouted in desperation, "Don't let him get closer! He has that woman's sword! Don't let him near!" The goblins that overwhelmed the dwarves gradually began to clear out, as they followed the Goblin King's orders and ran towards Aldril, leaving only a few to deal with the dwarves. Aldril calmly observed the horde of goblins running toward him, waving their rusty swords with savage enthusiasm, a spectacle that seemed more desperate than threatening to the half-elf. With a fluid and precise movement, he lowered his left arm slightly while subtly stepping forward with his left foot, preparing his newly learned stance. With grace, his right hand lifted the sword in a gesture that echoed the lethal elegance of the twin moonblade stance, a posture many Elden Ring players would recognize. Aldril used this deadly stance due to the number of enemies. Each movement would be calculated not only for defense but to launch devastating counterattacks. The stance granted him an explosiveness of supernatural speed and surgical precision in each strike. The goblins, blinded by their own ego of being the majority, barely had time to react before Aldril's sword, with a hum, cut through one after another, the goblins falling like flies. The dimensions of the bridge weren't very large, so the goblins clustered together, allowing Aldril to kill more than 4 goblins in a single slash. Aldril's evolution was evident, as if it were the Aldril from a few months ago, the goblins would have easily overwhelmed him. The Goblin King felt desperate. That damn human was killing his people as easily as that woman did. Amid his panicked screams, a blinding white light appeared, followed by a sudden magical explosion, causing all the goblins, including him, to be thrown into the void. Aldril crossed his 2 swords in an X, enduring the magical wave that threw all the goblins into the abyss. The bridge and structure quickly emptied, and as the light dissipated, a tall figure with a pointed hat and grey robe, holding a staff in one hand and an elven sword in the other, appeared. Aldril identified the person and swiftly approached the group of dwarves, who were getting up, stunned by the magical explosion. "You took your time, Gandalf," Aldril said cheerfully, happy that Gandalf had appeared, as their chances of survival increased considerably with the inclusion of the Grey Wizard. Gandalf let out a sigh of relief. Fortunately, nothing serious had happened to the members of the expedition. A few weeks ago, the dwarves had left with Aldril and Bilbo. Gandalf didn't accompany them immediately, as he still had things to discuss with Elrond, Galadriel, and Saruman. Additionally, he was delayed further when he saw Aldril's horse followed by the expedition's other horses heading toward Caradhras. He quickly stopped them and deduced that the horse was trying to reach Erebor. Doing Aldril a favor, Gandalf contacted Radagast and asked him to take the horses to Erebor. With a quick glance, Gandalf looked at everyone. Seeing that no one was seriously injured, he shouted, "This is not the time to talk. Grab your weapons, we need to get out of here." At Gandalf's shout, the dwarves, still dazed from the blows and the magical wave, slowly got up. The ropes binding their hands had been broken by the magical wave, so they quickly ran to where their weapons were. They had to be quick, as the goblins around them descended from the bridges, extremely furious. Their Goblin King had been thrown into the void, and it was unknown if he was still alive, so they charged with all the fury their small bodies could muster. The dwarves were quick. Boffer was the first to arrive and swiftly threw weapons to his companions. "Keely," he shouted as he tossed a sword. "Bombur," he threw a spiked mace. "Gloin," taking the thrown axe, Gloin laughed heartily. "Hee hee, come on, you bastards. I'll fulfill my promise and kill you all," he shouted at the goblins charging towards them. His combat effectiveness had increased because, unbound and with his weapon, the dwarves were enemies to be feared, especially with the fury they harbored from being beaten. The goblins arrived quickly, and both sides plunged into a battle that became very intense in a short period. Gloin, with a smile on his face, began to count the goblins he killed. "Come on, you bastards," he shouted as he buried his axe in a goblin's head. With agility, he pulled it out and quickly struck a goblin on his left side. With another swift movement, he struck the neck of a goblin who had slipped to his right. "That's 3. Come for more." Bloom. Another magical wave shot out, throwing many goblins into the abyss. Gandalf, with his staff in one hand and an elven sword in the other, moved with the grace of a seasoned warrior who had faced countless battles. Slash! 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 Near him was Aldril, who continued to move his swords with lethal elegance. With a powerful swing of his left sword, he sent more than 5 goblins flying, his enhanced attributes demonstrating how much he had improved. Aldril and Gandalf, being the tallest, were the primary targets of the goblins, who considered them more dangerous than the dwarves due to Gandalf's magic and the human with the terrifying swords. Thorin Oakenshield, who had just experienced the humiliation of the Goblin King and escaped his troubles, finally had the chance to vent his anger. With his elven sword in hand, he began cutting down goblins one by one. Beside him were his nephews, Keely and Philly, who covered their uncle's back. As brothers, they demonstrated admirable coordination. When Keely struck a goblin with a backhanded blow, his brother Philly finished it off with a slash, and they took turns whenever they had the opportunity. Balin, being the oldest and most experienced, stabbed the goblins without making extravagant moves like the younger dwarves. He focused on delivering lethal blows and moving on to the next goblin. Thanks to the combined skills of the dwarves, Aldril and Gandalf, all the remaining goblins were quickly killed. The area was clear, but the problem was that they were in the heart of the Goblin Kingdom, and they could see countless goblins densely packed, running towards them from afar. No matter how elite and powerful the expedition team was, they would never be able to withstand such a long and intense fight. They would easily be overwhelmed by the sheer number of goblins. Moreover, the dwarves were extremely exhausted. It must be remembered that they had recently escaped from the stone giants and barely slept for a few minutes before being captured by the goblins. "Gandalf, there are too many monsters here. I think we should leave," said Aldril, knowing he could fight for a while longer but would eventually be overwhelmed by the numbers. Nodding at Aldril's words, Thorin looked at Gandalf. "We need to leave. We can't kill all the goblins." Agreeing with Aldril and Thorin, Gandalf turned around. "Follow me." As they ran across the hanging bridges, Gandalf asked, "I haven't seen Bilbo. Where is he?" "I haven't seen him. He might have managed to escape," Keely said between gasps. "I saw that Bilbo managed to escape his capture. The goblins didn't see him because he was so small," added Balin, his breathing increasing. "Right now, everyone was running, and talking while running could make you even more tired. Don't worry about Bilbo for now. More and more goblins are coming. It'll be hard for us to leave if we delay talking," said Thorin. His tone of voice showed his exhaustion, but as a proud king, he didn't show it. "There! I see Thorin. Get him!" shouted a goblin, pointing at the group still running. "Kill him! Cut off his head!" The goblins' roars echoed behind them. As the great Goblin King had said, Thorin's head had a high price. To the goblins, Thorin was a walking bag of gold. His head was coveted by all the goblins, who needed that gold for weapons and food. They hurried their pace. Some didn't care about the reward. They were extremely angry that these bastards had thrown their king into the void, believing they had killed him. "Kill them! Avenge his majesty! Kill them!" The group was running among the bridges when, at some point, one of them collapsed, causing Gloin and Aldril to fall. Both landed on the hanging bridge below, causing the rest of the team to panic. Gandalf, the calmest of all, shouted, "Are you all right?" "Yes, we need to keep running." "We'll follow you from below," Aldril shouted back as he started running alongside Gloin, who had a smile despite his exhaustion. "Very well, follow us and don't get lost," Gandalf replied while running and guiding the dwarves. He knew the way out since he had once passed through the Goblin Kingdom, needing only a few gold coins for them to let him through. As they followed Gandalf's group, Gloin, who was behind Aldril, said, breathless from fatigue, "Hey Aldril, let's make a bet. Whoever kills the most goblins wins all the others' coins." At Gloin's words, Aldril was speechless, now understanding where Gimli's love for betting came from. Nodding, Aldril said, "All right. In that case, let's count how many we've killed." "I've got 12, Gloin said, his competitive spirit awakening, which made him feel less tired. "I've got 30 goblins." "Damn it, are you sure you counted right?" "Let's talk about that later, Gloin. We need to get out of here first." With that, Aldril picked up the pace, having sheathed one of his swords as it was more comfortable to run with just one. Seeing some goblins running towards them from the front, he prepared to kill them quickly. "Fuck. Web novel wouldn't let me log into my account, I don't understand why. Anyway, enjoy the chapter you filthy orcs." Chapter 47, Escape from the Goblin Kingdom 1.5. General POV. Moving swiftly, Aldril swung his right hand, followed by a diagonal move with his left. This combination decapitated one goblin while the second move slashed the chests of the remaining two, sending them tumbling into the void. Aldril sighed, his accumulated fatigue was beginning to recede, thanks to the elven stone given to him by his great-grandmother. It glowed, accelerating his recovery and allowing him to keep fighting despite not having rested enough. With the path now clear, Aldril started running but turned around when he didn't hear footsteps behind him, only to see Gloin with a bewildered look on his face, as if he were stupid. Aldril's quick movements had left Gloin stunned, as he could only see the black and white blur of swords before witnessing the goblins being easily slain. He had never seen such swordsmanship, leaving him dumbfounded. Fortunately, Aldril was there to snap him out of his trance. "Stop making that stupid face, Gloin. We need to go," he shouted before turning around and following the others. "Who are you calling stupid?" Gloin roared as he ran with his short legs. He had made a grave mistake for a warrior by becoming stunned, and he knew it. That's why he didn't argue further, fearing Aldril would call him a novice again. Fortunately, they didn't encounter any more goblins on their side, as the many hanging bridges made it almost impossible to face a goblin group head-on. However, this didn't apply to Gandalf's side, as they ran across a bridge only to encounter a group of goblins unaware of what had happened to the king. Additionally, the pursuit proved fruitless due to the poor quality of the hanging bridges, many of which collapsed under the weight of the goblin horde. Nonetheless, this did not stop the chase. Blinded by hate and greed, they didn't care about their comrades' deaths. The number of goblins chasing them increased drastically within minutes, making the expedition members nervous, prompting them to quicken their pace despite the risk of falling. "Hurry up!" Gandalf shouted, slamming his staff into an incoming goblin and sending it tumbling down. He couldn't understand how these dwarves had such bad luck. First, they encountered a group of orcs, then fought trolls, escaped another orc pursuit, and now they were fleeing from goblins. He still couldn't fathom how the dwarves had gotten themselves into this mess. "I think we'll die here," Gloin told Aldril, who slashed a goblin's arm that had attacked him and then kicked it off the bridge. "Don't be stupid, Gloin. We won't die here," he responded with a smile. Another goblin charged at him, but Aldril moved swiftly, stabbing the goblin in the stomach. With the sword still embedded, he forcefully threw the goblin, knocking down others charging at him. "By the way, I'm up to 8, Aldril taunted, trying to dispel Gloin's negative thoughts with their bet. It worked, as Aldril's words lifted Gloin's spirits, making him roar, "That's not fair. You're ahead and not letting any through." With a smile, Aldril looked around. The entire Goblin Kingdom was in chaos. The lack of organization and the poor state of the bridges caused many goblins to fall. They were so foolish that they were reducing their own numbers. "Hurry, we need to catch up with Gandalf." Both continued running, following Gandalf's group. A few meters ahead, there was an incline connecting to the upper path. With a shout, Keely pointed it out, "Aldril! Climb up here!" Without wasting time, Aldril and Gloin rushed toward the incline. At one point, 2 goblins leaped up, raising their swords, ready to kill these bastards who had slain their king. Aldril saw this and impaled one goblin in the air with his left sword. The other fell behind, only to feel an axe buried in its back. Gloin, with a grunt of satisfaction, shouted, "That makes 9 for me." With an exasperated laugh, Aldril continued on. The group was gathering ahead, Gandalf waiting with his staff raised, ready to cover them. "Quickly, more are coming!" Dwellin exclaimed, pointing to a new horde of goblins approaching from a side tunnel. "Damn it, these bastards are endless," Bombur panted. Despite being the fattest of them all, he was one of the fastest runners, proving that despite his obesity, he remained the swiftest runner among the dwarves. Wanting to delay the goblins further, Aldril cut the ropes holding the bridge, causing it to fall and create a large gap. This action would give them a few seconds of advantage, so without further ado, Aldril shouted, "This will hold them off for a few minutes, let's make the most of it." Nodding, Gandalf urged them to move, "Hurry up." The group was relieved not to encounter more goblins, making their escape smoother and faster. However, as they crossed a large bridge leading to a cave where sunlight could be seen in the distance, a loud crash stopped them. Ahead, the obese Goblin King had blocked their path. "Haha! Do you think you'll leave my kingdom without consequences? I'll kill you all and then claim the bounty for your heads!" He taunted, pointing his scepter at them. Everyone fell silent at the Goblin King's declaration, unsure where he had found such bravery. They outnumbered him, and he was just one. The Goblin King quickly realized the folly of his actions, as he faced the Grey Wizard and the man wielding swords that cut his spirit with their mere presence. With an ironic smile, he said, "Ah, I think I'll let you go. Yes, you can leave, besides." He didn't finish speaking because Aldril, with a swift movement, leaped and buried Angwirel in the Goblin King's head. The price for his stupidity was death. After Aldril pulled the sword from the Goblin King's head, the latter's body fell heavily, blocking their escape route for a few seconds. "Oops, sorry," Aldril said with a shrug, never imagining that the Goblin King's obese body would block their escape route. Fortunately, they had Gandalf for such situations. Gandalf sighed exasperatedly, murmured a spell, and cast the Goblin King's body into the abyss, clearing the way. "Let's hurry, the exit isn't far now." Nodding, everyone moved quickly. "Thanks, Gandalf, I owe you one," Aldril said, embarrassed. However, the Grey Wizard shook his head, "You owe me 3 now, Aldril." With a mocking smile, Gandalf led the group. "Is it really 3 already?" Aldril thought. The group got closer to the exit, and at that moment, they heard roaring and hurried footsteps. The goblins had arrived, charging with more fury, angered that these people were nearing the exit. Because it was still daytime, the goblins wouldn't dare to step outside and expose themselves to the sunlight, as they had never ventured out during the day and their bodies weren't accustomed to sunlight. Hurry up! Bomber shouted and ran, being the first to reach the exit. Soon, everyone followed and ran toward the exit. After a few seconds, everyone sighed in relief they had finally made it out, greeted by the sunlight. However, they didn't trust the safety yet and continued running down the mountain for an hour, following Gandalf's suggestion, who had advised them not to stop as there was a slight chance the goblins might still pursue them despite the sunlight. After hearing and seeing no signs of goblins chasing them, the group finally stopped and sighed in relief, having all survived the Goblin Kingdom. Gandalf, wanting to ensure no one was missing, looked around at everyone, who were all seated due to exhaustion. Counting them, he began, 1, 2, 3, 4, 14. Frowning, he counted again, only to discover a small figure was missing. Bilbo is missing, he said, frustration in his voice, still looking left and right, trying to find the little hobbit. This clearly caught the dwarves' attention, who felt bad, each having the same thought that Bilbo might not have survived. The group's mood darkened. Seeing his team's spirits drop, Thorin, who despite having grown a bit fond of Bilbo, said, "There's nothing we can do. If our hobbit didn't make it, we have no choice but to move on." Thorin's words didn't have the desired effect, as the group became even more depressed. Balin sighed sadly, looking at the others who had their heads down. "We should have a moment of silence for our dear hobbit." "Yes, it's the least we can do in his honor," added Boffer, bowing his head and closing his eyes in respect. "The hobbit earned my respect. I'll surely drink in his honor when we have time," Dwellin said, joining the others in offering their respects to Bilbo. Even Aldril began to panic. Bilbo was missing, and he feared that he might indeed be dead, in which case Gollum would still have the ring, and all subsequent events would go awry. But fortunately, his chaotic thoughts didn't last long, as a cheerful voice was heard. "What are you talking about? I'm not dead." Everyone quickly looked up, their once somber mood replaced by one of joy. The dwarves rushed toward Bilbo. "You bastard, we thought you were dead," Dwellin said, punching Bilbo's arm. "Damn it, Bilbo, you gave us quite a scare," added Boffer, who threw his arm around Bilbo's shoulder and shook him cheerfully. "It's good to see you're all right, lad," said Balin, approaching with a smile. Bilbo felt a tingle throughout his body, he never imagined he would be so appreciated by the dwarves. After all, just a few months ago, they ridiculed him. But now, being appreciated by future friends didn't seem so bad. "It's good to see you alive, Bilbo. I was about to go back and look for you," Aldril said as he approached and patted Bilbo on the shoulder. Bilbo smiled at Aldril's words, very grateful to have a friend like him. "After all, I did say I need to tell my adventures to the young folks back in the Shire, and for that, I need to be alive," Bilbo said, laughing along with the others. It was a very harmonious scene that made Gandalf smile. While the other dwarves continued teasing Bilbo, Thorin, with a tired face but energetic eyes, approached Aldril. "Aldril, thank you for saving me. Without your arrow, I probably would have died." Despite his pride, Thorin knew when to be grateful, especially when someone saved his life. Placing a hand on Thorin's shoulder, Aldril smiled. "That's what companions are for. I cover you, and you cover me." Aldril's words brought a small smile to Thorin's stoic face. "You're right." This scene was noticed by Gandalf, who smiled with amusement. He wondered if Thorin would say the same if he knew Aldril was half-elf. But knowing Thorin, he would likely still be grateful to Aldril, as he wasn't a pure elf. After everyone celebrated Bilbo's return, Gandalf approached and asked, "Where were you all this time, Bilbo?" Everyone fell silent, waiting for Bilbo's response, as they were also curious. A bit nervous, Bilbo was about to begin recounting his adventure when a distant howl made him forget what he was going to say. "Ayuyuyuyuyuyu." Everyone recognized this howl, and their faces changed. They hadn't been able to rest properly, and now those damned wargs were coming. The only thought they all had was, "You have to be kidding. We are in the top 10. I never thought I would reach that position. I am very grateful to you filthy orcs. This proves that we are the best race in Tolkien's universe. Ha ha ha." Chapter 48, Encounter with the Past. General POV. A few minutes ago, the members of the expedition, guided by Gandalf, managed to cross the dangerous hanging bridges of the Goblin Kingdom and escape the pursuit of the Goblin army. As they ran down the mountain, a troop of orcs mounted on wargs sped towards the Goblin Kingdom. This unit of orcs was the same one led by the Pale Orc. A few hours ago, they had been tracking the dwarves, but their progress was hindered by heavy rains that had washed away the scent of the expedition members. The wargs, having lost the trail, were delayed and lost the dwarves' scent for a few hours. However, this did not stop them. The Pale Orc, mounted on the Alpha Warg, roared orders at his subordinates with fury. "Find them! Locate anything that leads us to those pathetic dwarves!" The orcs, fearing their leader's wrath, redoubled their efforts, examining every rock and path for any clues. At that precise moment, a small goblin appeared, running with a dirty and worn scroll. Seeing this, one of the angry orcs quickly approached and, with a swift movement of his sword, decapitated the bewildered goblin, who did not understand why he was killed, as he had only come to deliver a report from his king. This was witnessed by the Pale Orc, who calmly approached and took the scroll the goblin had dropped. Intrigued, he opened it, and its contents made him smile with jubilation. With a roar, he shouted, "To the Goblin Kingdom! The dwarves are in the Goblin Kingdom! Hurry, you damned idiots!" The Pale Orc's command was like thunder resonating in the cold rain. The orcs, understanding the urgency, urged their mounts to quicken their pace. The wargs, being agile animals, could move through the mountains easily, unlike a horse, which was a bit clumsier in such terrain. Being faster due to their mounts, they did not take long to reach the exit of the Goblin Kingdom. At that moment, the excited members of the expedition were chatting merrily with Bilbo, unaware that the orcs had caught up with them. As Gandalf and the others had taken the same exit, it was easy for the Alpha Warg to catch the scent of the dwarves. Its keen senses indicated the path they had taken. The Pale Orc, seeing this, smiled with excitement, understanding what his warg wanted to convey. "The dwarves are this way, hurry!" At his command, all the orcs followed him downhill. Due to their speed, it did not take long for them to spot a group of dwarves in the distance who seemed happy. This excited the Pale Orc even more, as he anticipated the moment the dwarves would fall into despair. He urged his warg to howl, which had the desired effect as he saw the dwarves' expressions change. With a smile, he looked at Thorin and murmured with jubilation, "I finally found you." Wasting no more time, he raised his severed hand, which was attached to a sword, and then signaled towards the expedition group, shouting, "Kill them! Leave none alive!" The Pale Orc's shout caused the orcs behind him to charge downhill, excited. You must know that they had not eaten well in days, so seeing the group of dwarves triggered their hunger, and they could already imagine feasting on the corpses of the dwarves. With the expedition group. "You have got to be kidding me," was the collective thought of the group. That howl only indicated that there would be trouble. Their once joyful faces turned to ones of disbelief, annoyance, and frustration, so many changes that it would have been a fun display to watch. Gandalf, the most experienced, reacted the quickest and immediately shouted, "Run!" His shout snapped the group out of their stupor. It was a critical situation, and they could not waste a second, so they quickly followed Gandalf. But the wargs, being faster, would not allow the group to get far. The orcs' growls were quickly approaching, making the dwarves even more anxious. Thorin, despite the situation, remained calm. "Hurry!" he urged with a serious expression. Thorin's words were unnecessary because, with or without his command, everyone would run with all the strength they had left, even wishing they had 2 more legs to run faster. This time, fate was not on their side. Aldril, Bombur, and Bilbo, being the fastest runners, encountered a cliff, stopping them abruptly. There was no path ahead. This meant the whole group had no escape. This time, they could not flee and had to resort to the only option left: fight. "There's no path ahead!" shouted Bombur urgently. It was a situation they had not imagined, so they looked hopefully at the only wizard in the group, expecting him to use some spell to help them in this situation. "What do we do, Gandalf?" asked Bilbo, who had quickly approached. He knew Gandalf was the most experienced of them all, so he must have a solution. Branches were heard cracking in the distance, hurried footsteps and heavy breathing grew closer, a clear sign that the wargs were approaching. Finally, after a few seconds, a warg appeared in everyone's sight. The orc alongside the warg grinned with glee, they had found their prey. The presence of the warg prompted everyone to draw their weapons. Aldril, being the fastest of the group, drew his bow, placed 2 arrows on the string, and with a precise movement, killed both the orc and the warg, who did not see the attack coming. With an idea in mind, Gandalf shouted, "Wargs are not good at climbing trees, get up one." Without questioning Gandalf's words, everyone climbed different trees. Aldril, knowing what would happen, chose the most distant tree. While the wargs would be distracted by the closest ones, he would kill them from a distance, reducing their numbers and increasing their chances of survival if the situation changed. The area near the edge was filled with trees, so the members of the expedition quickly climbed the nearest ones. The dwarves, as if they had a gift for climbing trees, scaled them rapidly to the highest branches in a matter of seconds. This included Bilbo, who, by nature, was very good at climbing. Like Aldril, he chose a tree closer to the cliff. Just as everyone climbed up, more wargs appeared. They approached the trees with the intention of climbing, but due to the shape of their paws, they couldn't advance. This proved Gandalf was right, the wargs could only roar and show their fangs at the dwarves. Aldril smiled. This was the best situation for him. While the wargs focused on the nearby dwarves, he would kill them from a distance. Finding a comfortable position, he drew his bow. Shees. 4 arrows were fired, and with them, 2 wargs and 2 orcs fell. This scene delighted the dwarves. Yes. Well done, Aldril. They shouted with euphoria. Keely wasted no time and also drew his bow. Despite not having the same skill with the bow as Aldril, he performed well, killing the closest wargs that seemed to come endlessly. Out of the corner of his eye, Aldril glimpsed Gandalf whispering words to a butterfly that had landed on his hand. At that moment, more chaotic footsteps were heard, the orcs who had followed the wargs had arrived. Among them was an orc that Thorin knew very well. He would never forget that pale appearance, those scars, and the iconic diagonal scar from the collarbone to the waist, the bastard orc who had killed his grandfather. With venom in his voice, Thorin shouted. Azog. Omake. I don't remember what my real name was, I only remember my username as Nicholas Pence. I was getting ready to read the Lord of the Rings fanfic after a hectic day, but I had fallen asleep in the middle of reading, only to be woken up by a gruff voice shouting, "They killed His Majesty." This confused me. Who did they kill? I thought, still dazed. Looking around, I found myself surrounded by horrendous creatures that seemed to be goblins. As if struck by lightning, I inspected my hands, only to realize they were not human hands. What the hell? I shouted in fear. The goblins around didn't suspect anything, assuming I was shouting about the news that the Goblin King had been killed, so the idiots responded. Yes, what the hell? Yeah, we need to avenge His Majesty. I didn't understand what had happened. How did I become a goblin? Wait, did they say Goblin King and that he was killed? Don't tell me I transmigrated into the Lord of the Rings as a goblin, I thought worriedly. This world is so messed up, and the worst part is I transmigrated as a goblin. What do I do? Should I run? My thoughts were interrupted by the blood-curdling scream of a goblin next to me. With surprise and fear, I saw a human who looked like a younger Henry Cavill with honey-colored eyes killing the goblin beside me with a single thrust. Wait, that appearance, isn't that the protagonist of the fic I was reading? My thoughts raced, and realizing who this person was, I shouted in surprise, Aldril. He quickly turned to look at me and asked in a puzzled voice, "Do you know me?" Just as I was about to answer, my vision went black. Aldril. Haha, that's 5 for me, Aldril. I'm ahead, Gloin said after killing the goblin who had said my name. With a bored look, I glanced at him and then shook my head. I don't know how he knew my name, but oh well, I'll think about it later. Nicholas. What the hell, I shouted as I looked around. Apparently, I was in my room. It was a dream, I said to myself as I picked up my phone, which I had dropped when I got up so abruptly. Right, what time is it? I murmured as I unlocked my phone and realized the Patreon app was open along with the Lord of the Rings FIC. I think my dream was because I fell asleep while reading, I said to myself. As I glanced at the FIC, I noticed my username was there. What the hell, did the author make an omake with me? I have the common problem of the authors, when their story is on the right track several things happen to them, in my case the battery of my laptop burned out, today I went to get a replacement and hopefully everything will be fine. PSDT, my god. Since 8 AM I left my home and I'm just coming back, I'm so tired. Chapter 49, Traumatic Memory. General POV. Azog. Thorin's shout drew the attention of all the team members. They looked at the pale orc and recognized him, the younger ones from the stories their parents told them and the older ones from the battle outside Moria. Azog, the leader of the orcs, better known as the Defiler, was an incredibly savage, brutal, and strategic orc, according to what Aldril had heard and seen in the movies. He nearly succeeded in annihilating all the descendants of Durin, having killed Kili, Fili, and Thorin, although the latter eventually killed him. Aldril only remembered that Dane was the sole surviving descendant, which is why he ascended to king after Thorin's death. Aldril held his bow and drew the string, many thoughts coming to his mind. How many attribute points would Azog give? What would change in the plot if I kill him right now? However, he decided to let the plot scene unfold, lest his intervention disrupt the world's exploration by interrupting this encounter. Aldril's actions went unnoticed, as everyone was focused on Thorin, who looked at the orc that killed his grandfather with hatred. He was extremely angry and at the same time surprised, believing he had killed him in that battle outside Moria. But seeing him now brought back all those bad memories of that battle which, despite winning, they paid a great price for the victory. "You're still alive," he muttered through gritted teeth. He didn't care that he was surrounded by orcs, the only thing on his mind was to climb down from the tree and kill this bastard. Thorin's emotions, although well hidden, were seen by Azog, who looked at his prey with hatred and joy. He was sure he would kill all these idiots since he had brought more than a dozen wargs and 30 orcs, and Thorin's group was only 15 people according to the report. This would be a massacre. He would finally have the opportunity to kill the dwarf who had grievously wounded him years ago and would be closer to ending all the direct lineage of Durin. He only needed to kill that red-haired dwarf named Dane, and the entire legacy would die. This thought excited him, so with a voice full of malicious glee, he spoke. "It has been a long time, Thorin, son of Thrain." Then he made a sniffing gesture, adding even more mockery to the situation. "Sniff, sniff. I can smell it." He gently stroked the alpha warg, as if talking to his mount. With a disdainful smile, he looked at the entire team in the trees and said jubilantly, "I can smell their fear." His declaration made the accompanying orcs smile. He focused his attention on Thorin and continued, "Fear, what a delicious scent, especially coming from dwarves. I still remember your grandfather, before I decapitated him, he gave off the same scent. It was wonderful." The provocative words were like a lightning bolt to Thorin's ears. The accumulated anger inside him exploded, but due to years of experience, he suppressed these feelings for a moment. The hardships he endured over the years had further forged his character. But it was clear how much he was holding back. His breathing quickened, his fists clenched tightly, and a vein stood out on his forehead. Speaking slowly, he responded, "Did you feel your fear that day? I'm disappointed I couldn't kill you in that fight, but it doesn't matter anymore. You faced me again, this time, I won't fail." Everyone could hear the contained fury in Thorin's words. They feared that in his anger, he might not think clearly and recklessly charge at Azog. So, despite their fear, they prepared their weapons, ready to follow their king to the death. Azog was not very pleased. Clearly, Thorin's face showed extreme anger, but he hadn't provoked him as successfully as he'd hoped. The last words infuriated him. He raised his right hand, pointing at Thorin, and gave a loud command, "That dwarf's head is mine. Take care of the others." With his order, all the orcs roared. The warg riders quickly accelerated, and as they charged, Aldril's and Kili's arrows were fired. One of these arrows headed toward Azog, who, seeing it coming, smiled disdainfully. He raised his left hand, and the arrow struck the sharp blade he had as a prosthetic. This arrow was shot by Kili, hoping to catch Azog off guard, but he seemed to have failed. Aldril noticed this but was more focused on killing the wargs. He would have a perfect opportunity to shoot and possibly kill Azog later. The arrows began to run low. Many wargs were killed by Aldril, but there were too many to kill with all the arrows he had brought. The orcs were momentarily unsure of what to do. At that moment, seeing the stupidity of his orcs, Azog shouted, "Have the wargs bite the trees, you idiots!" He was so focused on waiting for Thorin to fall that he didn't pay attention to the burning wound on his chest. After their command, the orcs urged their wargs to bite the tree branches. Their teeth were capable of doing that and more. The tree trunk, being thin, could not withstand the incessant attack of the wargs for long and quickly began to creak. Nori, Ori, and Fili, who were perched in the tree under attack, shouted, "Aldril! Kili!" They clearly called out their names, hoping that with their arrows they would stop the wargs' attack, but there was a problem, Aldril was running out of arrows. Aldril shot arrows relentlessly, managing to kill several wargs attacking the trees, but if one warg was killed, another would take its place. It wasn't long before the tree began to creak. Crack crack! With the creaking, the first tree began to fall amid the exclamations of the dwarves. The dwarves who fell from the tree hurried to climb the other trees. Seeing this, Azog smiled with more glee. Hurry! Kill them! Don't let them climb the trees! As soon as Azog's words fell, the wargs and orcs roared more fiercely and ran towards the expedition members, who began to panic at the orc charge. Worst of all, Aldril had run out of arrows. The fight was inevitable, so the expedition members drew their weapons, ready for a head-on confrontation. Don't retreat! If we die here, do it with dignity! Shouted Balin, who climbed down from his tree. He wouldn't let his comrades fight alone. With him, the others began to descend from the trees. Thorin didn't think twice and calmly climbed down. He wasn't afraid of the imminent confrontation and possible death. He positioned himself in front of the dwarves and shouted, "Form up! We will not die here! Attack with all your spirit!" Aldril sighed and advanced slowly while putting away his bow and unsheathing his swords, Anglachel and Angwyrel, both shining in unison, eager to slice through the orcs. Ah! The dwarves gave a battle cry before charging against the incoming orcs. The wargs were the first to charge at the dwarves, opening their jaws to tear apart their prey, but a majestic light blinded and tripped them. The light came from Gandalf's staff, who also joined the fight. As they advanced, fiery pine cones were thrown at the orcs. Upon impact, these pine cones exploded, causing great damage. They were thrown by Bilbo, who, at Gandalf's request, began to hurl the enchanted pine cones. The clash became imminent, and the dwarves, fierce warriors, showed what they were capable of. With swords, axes, and hammers, they attacked the orcs, killing them. Aldril quickly joined the battle. A warg leapt at him, but with a swift X-shaped slash, he divided the warg. The orc riding it fell, surprise etched on his face, only to be impaled by Angwyrel. In a quick move, he covered his back with Anglachel in his left hand, instinctively blocking the sword of an orc planning to attack from behind. With a rapid spin, he used Angwyrel to hurl the impaled orc towards the orc that had attacked him, throwing them both over the cliff. Another orc, seeing this, charged at Aldril in anger, only to see a silvery white flash. With that flash, panic showed on its face as a line of blood formed on its chest, and with a thud, it fell heavily to the ground. "Damn it, I'm using more stamina than I'm recovering," Aldril muttered, panting. At his feet lay the corpses of the orcs. He planned to use Witcher signs to repel the orcs faster, but his body was not yet accustomed to the strain of using them. Boom! A magical explosion blew a dozen orcs away, some falling off the cliff. Clearly, this magic was cast by Gandalf, who was covering Bilbo, allowing the little hobbit to keep throwing the enchanted pine cones. Gandalf's attack caught the attention of 5 wargs, who charged at him. Aldril saw this and, fearing Gandalf couldn't handle them all, made a swift move as if sliding across the ground. He quickly reached Gandalf's side, and with coordinated movements, they attacked the incoming wargs. Aldril used a combination of diagonal slashes, his swords cutting through the wargs with ease. Gandalf, in coordination with Aldril, cast a spell that sent a warg flying, one that had been planning to attack Aldril from behind. After casting his spell, Gandalf stabbed a warg in the stomach as it leapt at him. "There are too many of them, Gandalf, we can't hold out much longer," Aldril said between gasps. Using the consecutive moves of Malenia and Relaena was exhausting him. It had only been a few weeks since he practiced these moves, so his body was still not accustomed to the speed at which they executed their attacks. "Hold on a bit longer," Gandalf replied, hoping the help he had requested wouldn't take much longer to arrive. "For now, focus on surviving," he shouted as he slashed an orc charging at him. "Damn it! These bastards are endless!" shouted Gloin, who regrouped with Aldril and Gandalf. Gradually, several dwarves began to regroup with them, their faces showing how utterly exhausted they were. "Where is Thorin?" exclaimed Balin, looking around desperately. He couldn't see Thorin in the fight, which worried him greatly. "There he is!" Keely shouted, pointing to Thorin, who was pulling his sword from the stomach of an orc. Near him stood Azog, who, with a ferocious smile, urged his mount to attack Thorin. Thorin clearly noticed this and, with a roar, charged at Azog. It wasn't long before they clashed. Boom! Unfortunately, Thorin lost and was thrown back with force. If not for the oak shield he used, it's estimated he would have suffered severe injuries. Despite losing the clash, Thorin managed to make the Alpha Warg stagger from the hard blow. Thorin quickly got up from the ground, showing he wouldn't fall so easily. Azog saw this with great annoyance and, giving a blow to his warg, forced it to regain its senses. Quickly, go to him! Azog roared, and with his command, his warg charged at Thorin again. However, to Thorin's misfortune, the warg opened its mouth, bit the oak shield, and with a shake, forced Thorin to release the shield and be thrown once more. Bang! With a heavy blow, Thorin hit a tree. The impact was so hard it left him dazed for a few seconds, allowing Azog to dismount and walk towards the stunned Thorin with a smile. You will die like your pathetic grandfather, Thorin Oakenshield. Azog's words made Thorin boil with rage, but his body could no longer take it. This time, he was completely defeated. He was already exhausted from the goblin chase, so it was not the best moment to face an orc of Azog's caliber. Perhaps if he were at 100%, the fight would be even, but unfortunately, that was not the case. With a look of defeat, Thorin prepared for his imminent death. Azog, with glee on his face, raised his prosthetic arm and swiftly brought it down, aiming to kill Thorin with one stroke. But at that precise moment, his prosthetic clashed with a sword that made his scar burn. Clank! Azog looked at this in shock. At that precise moment, a scent he recognized reached his nostrils. He lifted his gaze and saw a pair of honey-colored eyes looking at him with disdain. He recognized the scent and the color of those eyes, he would never forget them. A trauma he had buried deep within him resurfaced, and with a scared voice, he shouted, "Those eyes, I recognize those eyes." Vaguely, the figure of an elf superimposed itself on the figure of the human who blocked his attack, and he clumsily retreated. At some point, Aldril had blocked Azog's killing blow. Minutes earlier, he had seen Thorin being defeated, so he rushed to prevent him from being killed. Since Bilbo was still throwing the pine cones, he wouldn't have made it in time to save Thorin due to the change in the plot. Aldril stood protectively in front of Thorin, having a vague idea of why Azog reacted this way. So, in Azog's moment of weakness, he seized the opportunity to try to kill him. He placed his right foot forward, exerted force with his left foot, and lunged at Azog, making a diagonal slash with both swords. Azog did not expect this attack, and in a desperate moment, he took a step back. But it didn't do much good, as the tips of the swords cut him as if he were butter, leaving two huge lines of blood across his torso. Azog! Being cut by those swords was extremely painful, as if not only his flesh was being cut but also his soul. Azog's roar drew the attention of the orcs, who stopped attacking and retreated in fear, having seen their leader gravely injured. Azog quickly fell to the ground, watching in horror as Aldril approached with slow, deliberate steps. He was terrified, deeply afraid. Only one person had ever made him feel this way, and this human had the same scent as that woman. At that moment, he saw a glimmer of hope as his warg lunged at the human. The human didn't expect it, and with the impact, both fell backward. Azog seized this moment to shout, "Get me out of here, you damned idiots!" Quickly, two orcs lifted him and dragged him away from the battlefield. As he was being carried away, he saw his warg being killed by the same human. The warg's head was impaled, and with a roar of helplessness, he shouted, "Damn you! I swear I'll kill you! You cursed spawn of Tindomil!" He spent all his energy with those shouts and quickly passed out from the enormous wound in his torso. It was a reminder that both mother and son had nearly killed him. Sorry for the delay, here you have the chapter, you filthy orcs. They had already several days without eating, so I decided to feed them. Chapter 50, Leap of Faith. General POV. Thorin lay on the ground, the exhaustion from lack of sleep and the chase by the goblins had taken its toll. In this fight with Azog, he had lost due to fatigue, feeling an infinite rage. Would he die at the hands of this filthy orc? No. He wouldn't. He tried to get up, but his body wouldn't respond. He felt powerless as Azog wielded his prosthetic arm to cut him. With a sigh, he accepted that he would die. However, the pain of being cut never came, instead, he heard the collision of a sword. He slowly opened his eyes, an astonishing scene lay before him. At some point, Aldril had blocked Azog's attack. He could see Azog's face change from disbelief to shock and, was it fear? This orc was feeling fear. What did he think when he saw Aldril? Had they met before? Many questions arose, but he was too weak to think about them. He watched as Aldril cut Azog. A deafening scream of pain echoed across the cliff. It was the same scream he gave when his arm was cut off. Certainly, Thorin was very happy inside, hoping Aldril could kill the bastard Azog. But it seemed his wishes were not fulfilled. He saw Azog's white warg throw itself at Aldril. They fought for a few moments, giving Azog the opportunity to escape. That bastard will escape again, hide like the damn rat he is. This was his last thought. His vision began to darken, exhaustion was taking its toll, and he would soon faint. The last thing he managed to see was Aldril standing in front of him, covering him from some orcs who wanted to take the opportunity to kill him. "Thank you," was the last thing Thorin could say before fainting. Quickly, all the dwarves ran to cover Thorin's unconscious body. "Quick, take him to Gandalf, we'll stay covering the front with Aldril," shouted Balin, giving instructions to Keely and Philly. Both were the youngest and least experienced, he didn't want them to die in this fight. "Dwalin, Gloin, Nori, help me cover the front with Aldril. The rest of you cover our backs." Everyone agreed without objection. Balin was the most experienced of them all, and if Thorin wasn't present, he would take command. Yes, Gandalf was there, but they didn't trust him completely. Aldril slashed horizontally, cutting an incoming orc. Beside him, Gloin and Dwalin were chopping and embedding their axes into the orcs who kept attacking. Fortunately, their numbers had been reduced. Many of them left to protect their leader Azog, only a dozen orcs stayed to fight, the stupidest ones, as they only wielded their rusty swords clumsily. It didn't take long for the group to finish off the remaining orcs. Sighing, Aldril leaned against a nearby tree. He needed to take a short break. The movements of Relaina and Malenia wore him out a lot. He needed to adapt to these movements. "I need a break," sitting next to Aldril, Gloin exclaimed. They had very bad luck. It seemed destiny wanted to put many obstacles in their way to Erebor. "Let's hope nothing else happens," he said. Gloin's words made Aldril give an ironic smile. He knew that saying these words would raise a red flag, so he reminded him, "Gloin, you know you just raised a flag, right? Something bad is probably going to happen." "What are you talking about, Aldril?" "Of course, nothing bad will happen," dismissing Aldril's concerns with a hand gesture. Gloin was sure nothing bad would happen. They defeated the orcs, what else could attack them? As if fate wanted to prove it shouldn't be tempted, an avalanche of footsteps was heard at the top of the mountain, and screams echoed. Aldril recomposed himself and looked into the distance. Using his Hawkeye ability, he could discern many figures running towards them. Their short stature, poor equipment, pale skin, they were clearly goblins running towards them. Aldril's expression changed immediately. He looked at the sky and discovered that the sunlight had disappeared, now hidden by dark clouds, a prelude to the approaching rain. Aldril alternated glances between the sky and the goblins. "Damn it, I told you, Gloin, you and your big mouth!" he shouted, drawing everyone's attention. The others were confused. They thought the avalanche of footsteps was the orcs who were escaping, only for Aldril to correct their thoughts when he shouted, "The goblins are coming." Originally, Gloin wanted to complain about why Aldril said those words about him, only to be stunned when he heard that the goblins were coming. He understood what Aldril meant. "Damn it, next time I won't say anything," he murmured as he got up and grabbed his axe. It didn't matter that he was tired, he would fight, even if it ended in his death. The dwarves chosen by Thorin were well picked by him, as they were very stubborn, perhaps too much so, but within their stubbornness lay a great strength of will and tenacity, allowing them to face problems without retreating. Despite not having rested and having fought a battle, they took up their arms, ready to fight against the goblins. This time there was no escape, so they opted to fight and at least die with dignity. A few minutes passed, and everyone was in formation, ready for the fight. It was then that a loud eagle's roar spread across the sky, drawing everyone's attention, leaving them bewildered. The eagles began to descend, and Aldril was astounded, as the movies did not do justice to their size. Now, he could behold their full splendor. They were exceedingly enormous, their claws easily capable of holding 2 wargs and 3 orcs. He stopped staring at them and focused, hearing the avalanche of footsteps approaching. He reminded the others to stop looking at the eagles, "They're coming." His shout snapped them out of their stupor, and they concentrated on the upcoming battle. Within seconds, many goblins, packed together and without formation, appeared. Their sole objective was to kill those who had slain their king. Tensing their muscles, everyone waited for the imminent onslaught. It was at that moment that an eagle, with a roar, dove directly at the goblins. Its speed was such that it reached the clustered goblins within seconds, opening its claws and slashing through them. Many goblins were thrown off the cliff as the eagle pushed them, while others were cut by the eagle's passing claws. This action ignited everyone's morale, who, with renewed vigor, charged at the goblins that managed to escape the eagle's attack. Slash clink spish. The goblins were cut and stabbed, no match for the expedition team who were highly motivated. Soon, more eagles dove down, gradually decimating the goblins who didn't know what to do. They thought they would only face the dwarves and company, never expecting to be attacked by the giant eagles. Bilbo, in the rear, watched this in fascination. He looked at Gandalf and asked, "Are these the reinforcements you spoke of?" With a sigh of relief, Gandalf looked at Bilbo and, with a weary smile, nodded, "Of course, they came to help us." He was extremely happy. It seemed the expedition team would not die here. He had believed they were safe after repelling the orcs, but the goblin attack caught him off guard, causing him concern. But now that the eagles had arrived, his worries vanished. The scene of the eagles attacking the goblins was immensely beautiful in Aldril's eyes. He could see the goblins' wool crumbling, some even dropping their weapons and running uphill. Seeing how the eagles easily defeated them made them doubt continuing the fight. When they saw several eagles grabbing many of them and throwing them off the cliff, they no longer hesitated and began to retreat, running uphill to reach their kingdom and seek refuge there. "Ah! We won!" Seeing the goblins retreat, all the dwarves raised their weapons high and shouted in jubilation. This story would be told to their children and friends, of how they survived the stone giant's attack, the goblins' pursuit, the orc and goblin attack, undoubtedly a very good story. Watching the goblins flee, Aldril sheathed his swords and sighed in relief. He was utterly exhausted, starting to think the eagles would take too long to arrive, which worried him. But now, seeing them arrive and dissuade the goblins from continuing the attack, he sighed in relief. The plot had changed for his benefit. Azog was almost killed, and he was quite sure that in the future confrontation, Thorin would have the advantage over Azog. His rest was interrupted by Gandalf, who looked at everyone and said, "We must go while we can, we don't want anything else to happen, do we? Quickly, Keely, Philly, place Thorin near the cliff, let the eagles carry him. The rest, follow me." Aldril sighed, stood up from his crouched position, and followed Gandalf. The others also did as Gandalf asked and followed him. However, some whispered as they followed, "Why is Gandalf leading us to the cliff? Don't be stupid, it's obvious he wants the eagles to carry us. Hurry up, stop talking, and follow Gandalf." The eagles were aware of what Gandalf wanted, so they quickly flew towards the cliff, circling while waiting for the next action the expedition team would take. When everyone reached the edge, they glanced down and were a bit terrified, seeing that it would be a very long fall. While the others wondered what Gandalf was planning, he looked at Keely and Philly. "Place Thorin there," he pointed to the edge. Keely and Philly were a bit reluctant, they didn't know what Gandalf had in mind, but knowing he wouldn't harm them, they obeyed and placed the unconscious Thorin on the edge. "Now step back." With Gandalf's command, both stepped back and watched as an eagle descended slowly, gently grabbing Thorin's body with its claws, then lifting him into the air. This left the dwarves bewildered, watching as Thorin was carried away. "What do we do now?" asked Dwellin, looking at the others. "I don't know, maybe ride an eagle," replied Boffer, distractedly looking at the eagles. "Thinking about it makes me dizzy," added Bombur, holding his stomach as if about to vomit. Aldril, standing beside Gandalf, turned to him and, raising an eyebrow, said, "Will the eagles pick us up, or do we have to jump?" With a smile, Gandalf looked at him. "Guess," Gandalf's answer made Aldril smile. He guessed from Gandalf's smile that they would have to jump off the cliff. Just thinking about jumping and being caught by the eagles made his blood pump. "It'll be fun," he thought, "but why would he make us jump?" To answer his doubts, Aldril said, "Wouldn't it be easier to be picked up from here?" Aldril's question was answered with a snort from Gandalf. "Maybe, but they've been very rude." With those last words, Gandalf ran to the edge and jumped. Aldril gave an ironic smile, thinking that the Great Grey Wizard would get back at the dwarves for their bad behavior in this way. Shaking his head, Aldril watched Gandalf jump off the cliff. Gandalf's action caught everyone's attention, leaving them speechless, their legs trembling. Nervously, Gloin asked aloud, "He won't make us jump off the cliff to be picked up by the eagles, will he?" His answer was seeing an eagle carrying Gandalf on its back, who, with a mocking smile, shouted, "What are you waiting for?" All the dwarves looked at each other, reluctant to jump. Even Bilbo began to tremble and, with trembling steps, approached Aldril, nervously and hesitantly asking, "Do we really have to jump?" Bilbo's question was met with a smile from Aldril. "Come on, Bilbo, don't be a coward. Think about what you'll tell the kids in Hobbiton." With that, Aldril ran, passed by Gloin, and defiantly said, "Come on, Gloin, if you don't jump, you'll change your son's name and give him an elvish one." With that said, a smiling Aldril jumped off the cliff. He felt the wind hit his face, he felt free. It was a wonderfully exhilarating experience. He positioned his body to dive headfirst, trying to recreate the iconic scene where Miles Morales falls from a building. "A leap of faith," he murmured. Soon after, he was grabbed by an eagle, who then tossed him to another so he could land on its back. As Aldril fell, Gloin scowled at Aldril's taunt. "I won't change Gimli's name to that of a filthy elf." Determined, he placed his axe on his back and ran to the cliff, jumped, felt the air hit his face, immediately felt fear, but soon relaxed as he was caught by an eagle. Unlike Aldril and Gandalf, the eagle held him in its claws. "You know what? Screw it all!" Keely shouted, getting psyched up and jumping. Soon, everyone followed. The only one left staring at the cliff was Bilbo, who was pacing back and forth. "You have to do it, you have to do it, okay, breathe, Gathering his courage, Bilbo jumped, his small feet kicking in the air. He felt like he would die, but just a few seconds later, he landed on the back of an eagle, who barely felt the hobbit's weight. The giant eagles flew gracefully through the sky. Some didn't enjoy the journey due to the nausea caused by the heights, while others like Aldril were having a wonderful time. Watching the mountains wrapped in clouds, the bright sky with no clouds around made the view splendid. Having flown high, the grey clouds were left behind, with only the golden sun indicating it was midday. He felt the whistling wind hitting his face. Wanting to enjoy this sensation, Aldril extended his arms. Now he understood why in his previous life it was said that in the God books, the Targaryens enjoyed flying on their dragons, as it was a magical experience. He enjoyed this position for a while longer, then put his hands behind his neck and lay back on the warm, fluffy feathers of the eagle. The view of the blue sky brought tranquility to his mind. "Although I couldn't kill Azog, I did kill many wargs, goblins, orcs, and of course, the alpha warg. I don't know if that will give me many skill points," he murmured while enjoying the beautiful scenery. "Oh right, there's also the Goblin King." Out of curiosity, he opened his system, specifically the skill points column. Attribute points, 13. He raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Those are good points, I'll distribute them later. Right now, I just want to rest." Closing his eyes, Aldril allowed his body to relax. He would train later to get his body used to his new movements and, of course, strengthen his other attributes to make it easier for his body to adapt. "Maybe increase my sword skill. I'll think about it later." With that last thought, his body surrendered to relaxation, and within seconds, he fell into Morpheus' arms. "How disgusting! Did you see the last chapter of the Rings of Power? My god! How is it possible that orcs have families and fear the coming war because, according to them, they want a place to settle down and live in peace? Seriously, brother, even I wouldn't dare to do something so stupid." Chapter 51, Interlude. General POV. Mirkwood. Legolas was gazing at the horizon, thinking about the human who had caught his attention. He planned to sneak out at night and go to Esgaroth. He was determined to discover what this feeling was that he felt. Footsteps drew his attention, pulling him from his reverie. Turning to see the visitor, he found his best friend Tauriel approaching him calmly. "By the look on your face, I can see you have something planned," she said as she sat beside him. "I plan to go see her. I want to find out what this feeling is," he replied, knowing he could trust her. Despite being reprimanded by his father, she would always be there to cover for him. With a tired sigh, Tauriel looked at him, frowning. "Again? At this rate, I won't be able to cover for you anymore. Your father has started to suspect that I haven't been carrying out his orders." She wasn't happy. Lately, the king's reprimands had increased to the point where she thought she might be relieved of her position as captain. I'm sorry. I know I've caused you a lot of trouble, but it's something I have to do, he said, giving her an apologetic look. He had heard from other elves that his father frequently reprimanded Tauriel because of him. He even heard that she might be relieved of her captaincy. However, he had been selfish and kept causing his friend problems. Shaking her head, Tauriel sighed again, this time more heavily. It doesn't matter. I only came to find you to inform you that the Queen is looking for you. She said she had something to discuss with you. Tauriel stated the reason for her visit. If Aldril had heard this conversation, he would have been greatly surprised since in the movie's plot it was mentioned that Legolas's mother had died. Mother. Legolas frowned, looking at her. He had been avoiding her since she had also mentioned that nothing good would come of his relationship with a human. He couldn't understand why his kind mother had opposed this. Normally, she would support him, but this time she was against him, which hurt him, and so he had avoided her all this time. Seeing her friend's reluctant face, Tauriel turned to look at the horizon. I don't know why you're avoiding her. If she said that, it was for a reason. At least give her the chance to talk about the reasons why she doesn't want you to be involved with the human. Her words seemed to affect Legolas, who thought Tauriel was right. He hadn't given his mother time to explain herself. Maybe he guessed his father's reasons, but he was wrong not to let his kind mother give her reasons. With a sigh, he stood up. You're right. I'll go find her. Will you come? He asked, since his mother loved Tauriel like a daughter, so he saw no harm in her being present while they talked. Shaking her head in refusal, Tauriel remained seated, gazing at the horizon. No, your mother said she wanted to talk to you alone. All right, he said, turning and leaving. He understood that his mother, having asked Tauriel to find him, had already given him enough time alone to think things through. With the expedition team, a group of giant eagles soared high above. Plains, mountains, forests, and rivers adorned the beautiful landscape. Aldril was oblivious to this as he was asleep. Some in the group enjoyed these views, knowing that they had never met anyone who had experienced being carried by eagles, a truly magical experience. Those who were utterly exhausted, like Dwellin, Gloin, and Balin, who had fought the most, were asleep. Their bodies, feeling the relaxation of the environment, stopped producing adrenaline, causing them to fall asleep. The younger ones, like Kili, Fili, and Ori, were shouting with joy. They hadn't fought much, so they weren't as tired as the rest of the group. Unlike the dwarves, Bilbo, instead of enjoying the scenery, was lost in his own world, staring at the golden ring he found in the Goblin Kingdom. It seemed this ring was in the hands of that creature but had fallen when it was killing the goblins. It was also a magical ring because, while running, he accidentally put the ring on, and it appeared to have made him invisible since when he wore it, Gollum couldn't see him even when he was right in front of him. Ah! The silent atmosphere was broken by a scream. Bombur had a terrible dream. He dreamed he was skewered on a grill and eaten by trolls, causing him to scream in fear. This clearly woke up the other dwarves, who opened their eyes in horror. Damn it, get up! Bofur shouted, having woken up abruptly and not noticing that he was being held by the eagle's claws. What's happening? Nori joined him, looking around. Are there enemies? Alarmed, Dwellin tried to get up, only to realize he was being held by large claws. The dwarves who had just woken up from their slumber immediately tried to grab their weapons, only to react and realize they were still being carried by the eagles. Then they saw Aldril sitting on the back of an eagle, looking at them seriously. They had woken him up unnecessarily, his instincts told him there was no danger, but the shout had still awakened him, ruining the peaceful sleep he was having. The dwarf Bofur looked at Aldril suspiciously and said loudly, Aldril, was it you who shouted? Aldril shook his head. Because the eagles were flying very close, he could hear what Bofur said. No, but I'll kick the ass of whoever shouted. I don't like being woken up without reason. Gloin, who was angry at being woken up, looked at the others until his gaze settled on Bombur, who looked extremely nervous. So he asked loudly, Bombur, were you the one who made that strange noise a moment ago? Bombur quickly dismissed Gloin's question. No, it wasn't me. I just woke up too. Kili, seeing Bombur's nervous behavior, guessed that he was the one who shouted, but wanting to have some fun, said, Bombur sleeps heavily, I don't think it was him who shouted. Maybe it was Bilbo. After Kili finished speaking, Bilbo, who was at the back, saw how all eyes focused on him. He was clearly bewildered, just looking at his ring when Bomber shouted and woke everyone up. Now he was being blamed. After hearing Keely's words, Gloin immediately looked at Bilbo and asked loudly, "Was it you, Bilbo?" Not wanting to be blamed, Bilbo shook his head. "No, it wasn't me. I was awake, it was Bomber who shouted." Immediately, everyone's attention shifted to Bomber, who, seeing no other option, lowered his head. "I'm sorry." "Ah, bastard, no sorry, let us get to the ground, and I'll give you a beating," shouted an angry Gloin. "Bomber, I'll kick your ass," Aldril said calmly. He was tired, so after saying that, he lay back down and went back to sleep. Bomber, resigned, bowed his head. He knew Gloin's temper and was sure he would hit him. But Aldril wouldn't hit me just for that, right, he thought. The eagles, with a tacit understanding, flew closer to each other. They understood the dwarves were arguing and, wanting to join in the fun, flew closer so the group could talk and curse each other. As the golden autumn sun began to set in the west, the bright sky started to turn dark, and the stars shone in the sky, welcoming the night. The eagles that were transporting the team had flown from midday until the early evening, and after a few minutes, they began to descend, soon arriving at the top of an open mountain. The members of the expedition team were carefully dropped off one by one. It wasn't a very comfortable journey for them, the views were magical but very uncomfortable. The claws of an eagle are not soft, and every now and then, the tip of a claw would prick their behinds. Aldril jumped off the eagle's back, turned around, and politely said, "Thank you for the ride." He knew that because of his ability, he could speak all languages, so he hoped the eagle would understand his gratitude. After expressing his thanks, he turned around. When he took a step, a voice came from behind him. "You're welcome. As long as you fight against the orcs, you'll always find a friend in my clan." Aldril's step halted, he turned his head in surprise. He hadn't expected the eagles to talk, at most to understand him like Shadowfax. But it was logical, a creature so magical and intelligent would be capable of speech. After all, he was in Middle-earth, a magical place where anything was possible. Aldril's surprised face prompted the eagle to speak again. "Surprised?" it asked. Somehow, this human who also smelled of an elf pleased him. His aura was comforting, as if he was in tune with nature. Aldril set aside his surprise and, with a smile, apologized. "Sorry, I didn't see it coming." After all, he had only seen the Lord of the Rings movies, and none of them showed the eagle speaking. Shaking his head, the eagle didn't mind. "No worries, you're not the first nor the last to be surprised. In that case, my name is Aldril." "Nice to meet you," he said, thinking it wouldn't hurt to befriend a giant eagle. Sensing no fear from Aldril, the eagle introduced himself politely. "Erlinder, nice to meet you too, human Aldril, though you have the scent of an elf," he said, curious. The last time he felt both scents was from that elf who helped them repel the orcs who wanted to invade their home. The eagle, wanting to continue talking with Aldril, said, "I saw you. You killed Nazgûl. I appreciate it." "Nazgûl?" Confused, Aldril asked, having never heard that name. Seeing Aldril's confusion, the eagle clarified, "He's the White Warg, he was the Alpha. Now that he's dead, the Wargs will be more rebellious towards the orcs, which helps a lot." "Oh, I see, it was nothing, as long as I can help." Now seeing clearly, Erlinder found many similarities between this human and that elf, but he didn't dwell on it. It was getting dark, and he had to return to his nest. "Good luck on your journey." With that, he flew high. Like Aldril, Gandalf was also saying his goodbyes. "Thorin, give my regards to Gwaihir and thank you very much for the help," he said with a smile, never tiring of admiring the beauty of these creatures. "No need to thank me, Mithrandir. As long as you fight against the evil that plagues Middle-earth, our race will always be there to help. But if you want to thank us, visit our nest. The king always speaks of you and your adventures." After speaking, he spread his wings and flew off. Gandalf watched with his characteristic smile, having known these eagles for a long time, even being there when they were just fledglings. Everyone watched as the eagles left, and when they disappeared, they turned around. Thorin, who had woken up at some point during the journey, was looking into the distance at the imposing peak of a tall mountain. Balin stepped forward and stood beside Thorin, looking at the mountain with mixed feelings and whispered, "Finally, it's in sight, our home, Erebor. All the dwarves heard Balin's whisper. The older ones looked at the lonely mountain with much sentiment, while the younger ones didn't understand the feelings the elders were experiencing, as they had been raised in the Blue Mountains, so they had only heard of Erebor. Curious, Bilbo approached Gandalf and asked, "Is that mountain?" Before Gandalf could answer, Thorin looked at him and said, "That is the Lonely Mountain, our former home." At night, on the edge of a forest, a faint light was present, clearly a campfire that the team had made. Around it, there were some deer legs, and the group was enjoying the relaxing atmosphere. Next to Aldril sat Bilbo, who was worriedly looking at the battered Bomber. Yes, Aldril and Gloin had kept their promise and kicked Bomber's ass, who couldn't put up any resistance. While the team was having dinner, Balin asked a question that many wanted to ask. "By the way, Gandalf, why didn't we ask the eagles to take us directly to the Lonely Mountain?" Everyone wanted to ask this question, as it would make their journey even easier. Gandalf, aware of their doubt, explained, "It's impossible. The Eagle King doesn't allow members of his race to approach such a place, especially with Smaug's presence. He doesn't want any of his kind to die uselessly." Everyone nodded in agreement. They could understand the reason, but the younger dwarves were dissatisfied. This was clearly noticed by Thorin, who just waved his hand, indicating it didn't matter. "It doesn't matter, they brought us close enough. It's only a matter of time before we arrive. For now, focus on resting properly. We'll depart early, the sooner we get there, the better." With that said, no one spoke any more. They finished their dinner and went to rest. The blankets were taken out from Aldril's storage ring, something he would have to explain to Gandalf in the morning. Here is your chapter of the day, Disgusting Orcs. You can start eating now. Remember to leave a review if you are enjoying it, and don't forget to support me on Patreon, where there are 15 chapters ahead. Chapter 52, Difficult to Accept. Mirkwood. Legolas walks calmly towards his parents' room. Moments ago, Tauriel had informed him that his mother was requesting his presence. He wanted to find out why his kind mother, who always supported him, was opposed to the idea of him spending time with Sigrid, Bard's daughter. Bard was the man who often visited the port to collect the wine traded between the Wood Elves and the men of Esgarote. After a few minutes, he found himself in front of a door adorned with exquisite carvings. The door bore several Elvish inscriptions detailing the year it was made and other information. "Talk, talk." Knocking softly on the door, he waited for his mother's permission to enter. He didn't have to wait long, as within seconds, a melodious voice filled with kindness was heard from the other side. "Come in, my son." Opening the door, Legolas found himself in a spacious room that radiated warmth, whether from his mother's presence or something else, he couldn't tell. Seated on a couch by a bookshelf was an extremely beautiful elf. Her blonde hair resembled the soft summer sunlight, and her sky-blue eyes, full of warmth, looked at him with great joy and affection. Her smile enhanced her already beautiful face. "It's good to see you, mother," Legolas said dryly, with the etiquette his father had taught him since childhood. However, this behavior did not please his mother, who with a wave of her delicate hand made a dismissive gesture. "Don't be so stiff with your mother, dear. There's no need for that boring etiquette when we're with family. Now come, sit down. We have much to talk about." With a gesture of her hand, she indicated the other couch in front of her. Nodding, Legolas sat down. Only a wooden table with floral arrangements separated them. They remained in a comfortable silence while his mother tried to find the best way to start the conversation. After a few seconds, she spoke in the most affectionate tone possible. "I think I've given you enough time to think, dear. So let me ask, do you still want to keep seeing the human woman?" she asked. She could guess the answer, her son was probably in love with that human woman. Initially, she and Thranduil had believed it was just curiosity on their son's part, as he had never seen a human woman before. But that thought vanished when they found out their son ventured outside the kingdom for days just to see the human woman. She was happy, she wouldn't deny it, but also worried. What mother wouldn't be happy and concerned about her son's first love? However, she knew that her son's love was impossible, as fate would not allow it. "Yes, mother. I've had this strange feeling. Not seeing her makes me sad. That's why I want to understand this feeling. I plan to keep seeing her, with or without your permission," Legolas declared, maintaining his serene demeanor. He planned to spend time with Sigrid and had decided to take the next step and get closer to her. With a sigh, his mother slowly stood up. Every movement she made exuded elegance. With calm steps, she sat next to her son and gave him a gentle hug, conveying all her maternal love through that act. As if returning to his childhood, Legolas unconsciously leaned into his mother's embrace. Still hugging him, his mother, with her melodious and affectionate voice, began to speak. That feeling is called love. It is a very beautiful thing, but it can also be tragic, she said, as she started to caress her son's soft hair, a consoling gesture for the information that would follow. There was only one case in all of history where an elf fell in love with a human woman. Lady Galadriel's elder brother, Aenir, who fell deeply in love with the human Andreth. Unfortunately, fate decided to separate them. They never married or had children. Shortly after their separation, Aenir perished in battle against Morgoth, and Andreth, in her sorrow, died of depression, she explained. It had been a long time since she had read about them, a tragic story that could not be, due to what was written by the great Eru. Why are you telling me all this, mother? Legolas asked. His mother's gentle gesture calmed him, but he still didn't understand why she was giving him this information. Because I fear that fate will hurt you. Why would fate hurt me? Separating from his mother's embrace, Legolas looked her in the eyes. He couldn't understand what fate had to do with his desire to be with Sigrid. With a sad sigh, his mother looked into his eyes and gently placed her hand on his cheek. Because it is said by the great Eru that there will only be 3 times when the union of both races, elf and human, will be permitted. One has already occurred, Tuor, a mortal, and Idril Celebrindel, daughter of the king of Gondolin, the parents of Arundel. The second was the marriage of Beren Urchamian and Luthien Tinuvil. I consulted Lady Galadriel about whether you and Sigrid could be the third couple to unite both races, but unfortunately, I received a negative answer, she said, her eyes filling with tears. It pained her to say this and crush her son's hopes. You cannot be the third, my son. It would go against the designs of the great Eru. Stunned by the information he had received, Legolas remained silent. As he lowered his head, he felt sadness, his chest tightened, and a tingling sensation ran through his stomach. If it was something said by the great Eru, there was nothing he could do. With clenched fists, he stood up and hurried out of his parents' room, wanting to be alone. As Tauriel walked through the halls, she encountered Legolas, who was heading towards the forest, clearly wanting to leave the kingdom. She quickened her pace, managing to catch up with him. Legolas, she said, grabbing his arm. However, what she wanted to say got stuck in her throat when she saw that his best friend's eyes were glassy. Legolas, despite being emotionally unwell, gently took Tauriel's arm and moved it away from his own. With a broken voice, he said, I want to be alone, Tauriel. Don't look for me. He didn't wait for a response from Tauriel and continued on his way. With Aldril. I already told you, Gandalf, I found it in the troll's cave. When we left Rivendell, I discovered it was a storage ring, I said, sighing in boredom. I had spent more than 2 hours convincing Gandalf that this ring was not evil. Magical rings are not toys, Aldril. I need to be sure it's safe for you, Gandalf replied. His attitude showed he wouldn't leave until he was sure my ring had nothing to do with Sauron. For the great all, give him your damn ring so he can inspect it. You've been at this for 2 hours, and I'm getting fed up, said Gloin irritably. I turned to look at him with a raised eyebrow. Besides Gandalf and Bilbo, the dwarf was the one I got along with best, so it was normal for him to talk to me that way. Wanting to put this matter aside, I sighed, took off the ring, and handed it to Gandalf. Here, you can inspect it, I said, extending my hand so Gandalf could take the ring. With nervousness written on his face, Gandalf took it. He examined it delicately, his face occasionally furrowing as he clearly wanted to determine if it was the one ring. He closed his eyes for a few minutes, then opened them and, with a relaxed demeanor, handed it back to me. Here, there's no problem with you using it. It appears to be just a storage ring. They are extremely rare, throughout my life, I've only heard mentions of them. This is the first time I've seen one. Take good care of it, he said, smiling at me. Not being stingy, I nodded. I could understand his concern, but my ring was silver in color, like moonlight. As for the one ring, Bilbo had it. I wanted to tell Gandalf about it from the beginning, but when I was about to, the voice that had allowed me to acquire my 2 sword skills whispered another message to me. Flashback. When the group was about to sleep, Aldril wanted to approach Gandalf and secretly tell him that Bilbo had a magical ring. With Gandalf's intuition, he would eventually discover that it was the One Ring. But when I tried to get up, an unknown force kept me lying down. At that moment, an incredibly beautiful yet powerful voice whispered in my head, "The shadow must remain in ignorance until the designated time. Those who know the truth, keep silent, and protect the secret of the One Ring. Only then can the plan set from ancient days be fulfilled, and hope prevail over darkness. Thus we decree, we, the Vala, guardians of Arda and the fate of all its inhabitants. Let this mandate be remembered and respected until the moment of truth arrives and destiny is fulfilled." Those words struck me deeply. The Vala, who were the gods/angels guarding Middle-earth, were still attentive to everything happening. This voice was possibly from the Great Varda, with whom I was most closely connected. So, not wanting to go against their will, I remained silent. I could only murmur, "So be it, my lady." If I had opened my eyes, I would have noticed that my hair was glowing faintly in tune with the stars, clearly showing that the Great Varda was pleased with my behavior. Present. My conversation with Gandalf was overheard by Bilbo, who also wanted to know more about the ring he found in the Goblin Kingdom, but something prevented him from asking Gandalf. So he decided not to mention anything about his magical ring. "Gather your things, it's time to go," Thorin's voice rang out. We had finished breakfast, so it was time to leave. Since everyone already knew about my magical ring, they asked me to continue storing their belongings in it. I raised an eyebrow at their request. I didn't mind storing their things, but Thorin, with a very different attitude, approached me and said he would add more gold to my contract for helping with their luggage. His attitude towards me had changed. You could say he trusted me more, possibly because I had saved him on more than one occasion. Hours had passed, and we were still walking through the forest. Gandalf, Bilbo, and I found ourselves at the back of the group. Bored by the silence, I decided to ask a question that probably puzzled everyone who had only seen the Lord of the Rings movies. "Hey Gandalf, I was wondering, dwarves and elves don't get along, do you know why?" I asked carefully and in a low voice, but it seemed Gandalf didn't mind if others heard us. "Well, it's quite curious. Both races have a very strong racial hatred for each other, and this has been going on for centuries. I don't know why their racial hatred began," he said. Clearly, he knew but didn't want to mention that humans and elves were created by the great Eru, while dwarves were shaped by All and later given life by Eru, but they were not his creation. This natural animosity was something he didn't want to explain. I felt a bit disappointed by his response, but my disappointment didn't last long because Gandalf continued speaking. "What I do know is that there was only one time when dwarves and elves had a friendship. The elves of Eregion and the dwarves of Moria in the Second Age formed an alliance that took the craftsmanship of Middle-earth to its peak. But this alliance happened because the elves of Eregion fervently desired knowledge. They, like the Noldor of Fëanor and the Dunedain of Numenor, fell into corruption due to their own desires. This clearly left everyone astonished. No one knew this, and I even saw Thorin's eyes widen in surprise. This information was incredibly valuable, and Gandalf shared it as if it were nothing. Although I didn't know who the Noldor and the elves of Eregion were, it sounded like they were important. "What? Why did everyone stop?" Gandalf asked, confused, until he suddenly realized and with an O understood that what he had said was incredibly impactful for everyone, especially the dwarves. Despite the dwarves of Durin being the least racist towards elves, they still harbored enmity, and it was surprising to them that members of their race had friendship with elves, particularly the dwarves of Moria. It was to be expected, the idiots got corrupted by their own stupidity, Dwellin mocked. It was shocking to know that at some point, dwarves had friendship with elves, but what did it lead to? It led to those foolish elves becoming corrupted. With an exasperated sigh, Gandalf continued walking, not wanting to hear the dwarves' diatribes. Quickly, we all resumed walking. As we moved forward, people occasionally asked Gandalf about this friendship. He clearly only answered those who wanted to know more, and I was among them. "At least it won't be a boring journey from here on," I murmured as I looked ahead at the lonely mountain. We were getting closer, and I was extremely nervous about what lay ahead. But before that, I needed to increase my attributes, and I would do so once we rested. "You dirty orcs! You've disappointed me. No positive reviews lately. Stupid humans are leaving us negative reviews. You have disappointed us all, so I have resorted to asking the Uruk-hai for help, perhaps they will support us in our fight." Chapter 53, Upgrading. General POV. Expedition Team. Currently, the group was lying around a campfire. Bomber and Boffer had been chosen for the night watch, allowing Aldril to focus on increasing his stats. He had been postponing it, but it was time to use those attribute points. So, while he kept his eyes closed, he opened his system panel. To run, the familiar sound made him smile unconsciously. That sound always reminds me of the Resident Evil menu, he thought, as nostalgia washed over him when he remembered that sound. It was one of the few things that connected him to his previous life. Name, Aldril, Ancient Shining. Race, Human Elf, Peridil. Attribute points, 13. Attribute, Strength LV1, Constitution LV1, Agility LV1, Mentality LV1. Skill, Universal Language, Military Survival LV2, Dancing Star LV2, Archery LV3. Talent, Good Fingers, Special Skill, Hawk's Sight, Skill. World Exploration, 6.0%. World Exploration caught my attention, it seemed to have reached 6%. However, as I thought, I will only receive rewards once I reach 10%. But that doesn't matter now. My attribute points need to go into my stats. Today's fight showed that I need to improve in these areas, especially in Constitution. Yes, the Elf Stone helps, but with Constitution at level 2, my recovery should be able to match my exertion, or so I hope. Without further thoughts, I began to increase my stats. It took 2 points to level up to 2, and my 13 points would allow me to level up all 4 attributes, so there would be no problem. Strength LV1 - Strength LV2. Constitution LV1 - Constitution LV2 attribute points, 5. Agility LV1 - Agility LV2. Mentality LV1 - Mentality LV2. I felt the same warm current coursing through my body, but this time, with my mother's coat, I felt a comforting sensation, almost as if she were hugging me. This boost wouldn't only help improve my technique but also accelerate my body's adaptation to the swift and precise movements of Relaina and Malenia. 5 attribute points remained, and I wasn't sure where to allocate them. It's better to save them, they could save me in a critical situation. With this thought, I yawned, waking Boffer and Bomber, who seemed to have just started dozing off. Before falling asleep, a question crossed my mind: why didn't I have the dream where Relaina and Malenia taught me their moves? I only remembered how to use them. I'll think about it later. With that final thought, I let the comforting warmth of my mother's coat envelop me and drifted off to sleep. Aldril's dream. The landscape was different from what Aldril remembered. There were no longer the vast forests that brought him so much peace. Instead, he found himself in a desert-like place. The ground was a vast expanse of water, and the stars shone brightly. The most striking feature was the 2 moons in the sky, one dark blue and the other a lighter blue. They were exceptionally beautiful, like twins. It was a strange but incredibly beautiful sight. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, perhaps due to the stars or the quiet surroundings. In this warm setting, a mist appeared, bringing with it an incredibly beautiful woman. Her silver armor gleamed in the moonlight, and she held 2 swords in her arms. The sight of this woman froze Aldril in his tracks because he knew who she was. I am Relaina, Twin Moon Knight. From what I've seen, you've learned my moves. However, you lack the elegance and lethality they should possess. You're missing the basics, and that's why I'm here. Her introduction was extremely elegant, demonstrating the grace the Carrion should have. Relaina said nothing more and adopted her characteristic stance. Her black hair swayed gently, as if moved by an invisible breeze, giving her an even more elegant appearance. Just by looking at her stance, he immediately understood that she would teach him through combat. Mimicking Relaina's stance, Aldril prepared for his next lesson. He didn't know why she appeared to teach him now, but he pushed those thoughts aside as Relaina launched toward him with extraordinary speed. Of course, Aldril responded by clashing both swords with Relaina's. Quickly positioning himself at her side, he executed a slash, which Relaina blocked. At that moment, she spoke again. The twin sword style requires more than strength, she explained, moving with almost supernatural grace. It needs balance, coordination, and a deep connection with your weapons. With a counterattack, she sent Aldril flying back. Launching at Aldril again, she executed elegant yet extremely dangerous slashes. When her sword grazed Aldril's cheek, she said, "Observe how my swords complement each other," continuing with an arcing attack from her right sword while her left prepared for a counter. It's not just about attacking but creating a constant flow of movements. You must be as fluid as water. With another clash that sent him back, Aldril stabilized and tried to mimic her movements. Raising his swords, he executed another counterattack, his movements becoming more fluid. It was as if he were blending Relena's style into the combat, his basics strengthening, allowing him to move with more grace. Their combat continued for a few more hours. Aldril was panting, facing Relena had left him exhausted. She also had sweat on her forehead but was in better shape than Aldril. Letting out a sigh, Relena dropped her stance and relaxed, turning her gaze to the twin moons. You've learned well, but remember that mastery requires constant practice. She turned back to Aldril, her eyes holding an indescribable emotion. With a charming smile, she said, "It's gratifying to know that my style won't be lost. Now, it's time for me to go. You've done well." Her words conveyed joy because her style would have been lost to history after her defeat. Now, she had someone to remember her. With one last smile, she began to turn into mist. Her final words before disappearing were, "Trust in your abilities." I nodded in gratitude. Despite her cold demeanor, I could feel through our clashing swords the joy she felt in teaching her sword style. It was a shame she couldn't teach me magic, as she mentioned that magic in the world of the Lord of the Rings was more mystical than that of the lands between and couldn't be used as easily. As always, I made a respectful bow. "I thank you for the lesson," I said. I saw a smile form on her beautiful face before she disappeared. Soon, my surroundings began to blur, a clear sign that I was waking up. Mirkwood. Tauriel was deeply worried about her best friend. It had been a day since Legolas left the kingdom. Of course, his departure caused the king to reprimand her for not preventing it. But what could she do? She had never seen Legolas in such a state of mind, so she chose to give him some time alone. She was almost stripped of her position as captain, and if it hadn't been for Lady Tolvan, she would have been expelled from the kingdom for her failure. She sighed at the day's events. To relax, she went to her favorite spot, a tree located near the kingdom's gates. This tree was enormous. If you climbed to the top, you could see all of Mirkwood. But the truly fascinating view was at night when you could admire the vast stars in all their splendor. "Lady Tindamil, why didn't you take me with you?" she murmured while admiring the stars. She liked the kingdom, but her dream had always been to venture through Middle-earth and combat all the evil that plagued it. The adventures Tindamil had told her about increased her longing even more. Yes, Tindamil visited Thranduil's kingdom on her way to Erebor. She came specifically to kill Smaug because, unlike in the movies, the dragon would come out from time to time to feed, and many humans and elves were his victims. This reached Tindamil's ears, and she ventured to stop these killings. From what Tauriel had heard from her, Smaug had run to hide in Erebor, closing all the entrances. His encounter with Tindamil had left him very wounded, so he had no choice but to flee. Tauriel had asked to go with her on her adventures, wanting to be as strong as she was. But apparently, she was too young in Tindamil's eyes, who said she would come back for her when she grew up. However, more than 60 years had passed, and she never appeared, so Tauriel put her fantasy aside and prioritized her duty at the cost of her dreams. Shaking her head to clear those old memories, she focused on admiring the stars again. They brought her a lot of peace. "Great Varda, creator of the stars, what does the future hold for me?" she murmured. "With the expedition team. Damn it, Bomber, try to sneak food out of my ring again, and I promise I'll stick my sword in your ass," Aldril said angrily while washing his face. "Seriously, couldn't you last a single day, Bomber?" Gloin scolded, giving him a smack on the head. Moments ago, Bomber tried to take Aldril's storage ring. His justification? He was hungry and wanted to get the food. "Hurry up, we'll have breakfast and set off. We shouldn't waste any more time," Thorin's authoritative voice was heard. "Aldril, please get breakfast ready," Thorin indicated in a kinder tone. "I'm on it," Aldril said as he dried off, giving Bomber a threatening look. "And rest assured, I'll keep my word if you do it again." With that final warning, he headed to where everyone was sitting. He only heard a loud gulp from Bomber. "That's better," he thought. "The Uruk-hai proved to be more helpful than you filthy orcs. Come on. Give more power stones and maybe I'll spare you. These chapters that seem like filler will go up faster, plus they serve to build the world that Aldril will sooner or later explore in the years he will have before the events of Lord of the Rings." Chapter 54, Run. General POV. 2 months. An incredible battle was taking place. Dwarves were fighting side by side, and the orcs, who were not skilled with weapons, compensated for their weakness with numbers. A slaughter was unfolding outside Moria. Having been driven from their home by the dragon Smog, the dwarves sought alternatives. King Thror led them to Moria, where they found their ancestral home had been taken by orcs. A great battle ensued, in which King Thror died after being decapitated by the orc Azog. Meanwhile, Thorin fought off the orcs that besieged him, slashing diagonally and vertically, and many orcs fell at his feet. Ag! A roar escaped his mouth as he broke an orc's neck. It was at that precise moment that he saw his grandfather's head being held high. Azog was demonstrating his might. In the distance, his father watched this scene, just as surprised as he was. Thorin saw the rage fill his father's eyes, and with determination, he launched into combat against Azog. He watched the battle unfold. His father, in a moment of carelessness, was struck on the side, causing his weapon to fall. Thorin saw Azog approaching his father and rushed to help him in a panic, but he was too late. He watched as his father's head rolled to his feet, decapitated by Azog. No! He screamed in desperation, only for everything to turn dark. He opened his eyes, sweating and panting. He observed his surroundings and discovered that the team was sleeping peacefully. Just a nightmare, he murmured, massaging his brows. It wasn't the first time he'd dreamed of this. Maybe his nightmares would end once he killed that filthy orc. A nightmare. A sleepy voice was heard, making him look up. There, in the distance, was the hobbit Gandalf had recommended. He wouldn't deny that at first, he was skeptical about whether it was a good idea to bring him along, but over the months, the hobbit had shown he had a great heart. He didn't care about risking his life to help them, earning Thorin's respect. Yes, just a nightmare, Mr. Baggins, he said, then lay back down. He didn't want to explain much, so he preferred to try to sleep again. The next morning. Hurry up! Shouted Thorin, urging the others to follow him. Moments ago, Bilbo had heard the howl of a warg. Clearly, they had been caught up too. Are there orcs chasing us? Asked a sleepy Bomber. He, like the rest of the group, had been abruptly awakened, and some didn't know what was happening. No idea, replied Gloin, who still didn't understand what was going on. Not long ago, he was having a wet dream about his wife, only to be brought back from the dream world by a kick from Boffer. Probably not. I don't think I heard any movement, added Boffer. It doesn't matter. Just keep running, said Dwellin with a growl. He was extremely annoyed, he hated being interrupted when he was sleeping, but he couldn't say much since he had to follow Thorin's orders. The expedition team ran through the forest. Having been without incident for 2 months had made them lower their guard. This was a grave mistake. But what could they do now? They could only run, and hopefully, the orcs wouldn't catch up to them in a short time. The team ran, led by Gandalf, who knew these paths better. In such an emergency, he was the first to get up and lead their escape. While running, Gandalf suddenly stopped. Stop! He shouted in a whisper. This was a mistake since their escape route was downhill. Many dwarves, unable to stop, fell on top of each other. Fortunately, Aldril and Bilbo, being more agile on their feet, managed to stop at Gandalf's sudden command. Boffer, you hurt me, said Gloin, holding his crotch. Apparently, he had been hit by Boffer in the fall. Who told you to stop so suddenly? Boffer retorted, annoyed since he had fallen into a puddle of mud and his whole face was smeared. Damn it, Bomber, you're crushing me. I can't breathe. Dwellin shouted with a strained voice. Having Bomber on top of him was like being crushed by an elephant. Keely, your foot is stepping on my beard, said Balin with an irritated tone. He loved his beard, and now it was all muddy due to Keely's foot. I'm sorry, Balin, it was not my intention, Keely apologized as he lifted his foot and helped Balin up. Soon, everyone was on their feet. Some wanted to stay on the ground, as they were still very sleepy. Thorin, who had managed not to fall, approached and with palpable annoyance in his voice said, Gandalf, why did you stop so suddenly? SHH, lower your voice. Gandalf didn't explain. He made a gesture for everyone to be silent and pointed into the distance. Look there, he whispered. Everyone looked in the indicated direction and were surprised to see a giant bear scratching its back against the rocks on a rocky hill. Is that a bear? Bilbo asked incredulously. In all his years, he had never seen a bear so large. The incredulity of Bilbo was shared by all the dwarves, who, despite sometimes hunting bears, had never seen one of such size. Even Aldril was surprised. He had imagined who this bear was, but in the movies, it wasn't depicted as being so enormous. Aldril glanced at Gandalf, who only frowned but showed no shock or surprise in his eyes. Clearly, scenes like this didn't surprise him. At that moment, Aldril confirmed they had reached this point in the story. If he remembered correctly, that bear was named Beorn. While the group remained silent, waiting for Gandalf's next instructions, a howl was heard, darkening the faces of everyone present. "Awoo! Those damned orcs are catching up again," Dwalin said through clenched teeth. He was getting fed up with these bastards. If it weren't for Thorin, he would have stayed to fight, even if it meant dying. "Will we disturb that giant bear if we leave now?" Ori asked, looking at Gandalf, hoping for a response. "Probably. There's an open space, and it's likely we won't be able to escape him." "He'll catch us if we run," Balin said, shaking his head. They were running out of time. Unbeknownst to the dwarves, the giant bear seemed stimulated by the warg's howl. It turned its head in the direction of the howl, stood on its hind legs, and roared loudly in defiance. Roar! The roar was so thunderous that it provoked silence. Nearby birds and animals fled in fear. The expedition team stayed quiet. Gandalf, paying attention to the bear's every move, saw it turn its head in their direction. Urgently, he said, "Quick, get down." Everyone obeyed quickly and hid. Some dropped to the ground, others moved into bushes, and some hid behind a nearby rock. The situation wasn't good, and the dwarves looked at Gandalf with nervousness. "What do we do, Gandalf?" Dori nearly shouted. The urgency in his voice showed his anxiety. He wanted to keep asking, but was interrupted by Gandalf's irritated voice. "Shut up and listen. I know there's a house not far from here. Maybe we can go there and take refuge." Hearing Gandalf's suggestion, everyone looked at each other. They weren't sure if it was a good idea to leave their hiding spots with the bear so close. Thorin noticed the hesitation in Gandalf's suggestion and immediately asked, "Whose house is it? Friend or foe?" Gandalf, aware that lying wouldn't help, decided to be honest. He shook his head and continued, "He might help us, or he might kill us." Everyone fell silent, unsure if it was wise to gamble on their survival. Thorin, understanding the group's thoughts, asked, "Is there another option?" With a sigh, Gandalf looked at everyone and shook his head, "No, there isn't." Roar! The bear's roar sounded again, this time closer to their position, changing everyone's expressions. Gandalf had given the solution, now it was just a matter of whether everyone accepted it. Knowing time was running out, Thorin said reluctantly, "Then we'll gamble on him helping us." Nodding, Gandalf looked at everyone again. "Listen, that house is at the end of the open field ahead. We have to run as fast as we can and lock ourselves inside. Otherwise..." Nervously, Bilbo asked, "Otherwise what?" Roar! The roar sounded again, this time just a few meters away. Aldril quickly picked up Bilbo, knowing he'd get nervous and wouldn't run in time. "Otherwise, we'll be bear shit," he shouted, seeing the bear had spotted them and was running towards them. "Run now!" Aldril yelled as he dashed in the direction Gandalf indicated. In his arms, Bilbo hung like a sack. Seeing the bear chasing them, Bilbo hit Aldril's arm, shouting, "Run faster, Aldril! I'm doing my best. Filthy orcs! A human disease almost killed me. Be careful and wrap up warm." "No kidding, I got so sick that it was hard for me to write, sorry for the delay." Chapter 55, Paintings from the Past. General POV. Mirkwood. Tauriel walks through the beautiful and colorful corridors of the Elven Kingdom, her surroundings showcasing highly advanced architecture that offers a spectacular view. The hallways are illuminated by the soft glow of the sun, with architecture that makes the most of natural light. Her long, reddish-brown hair sways gently with the soft breeze that filters through naturally, giving her an elegant appearance. Every elf who passes by greets her respectfully. After all, she is the captain of the Elven Guard, which grants her a very important status. Today was one of those days when she set out to explore the forest and, incidentally, eradicate any spiders she encountered nearby. This had been a routine for the 40 years she had served as captain. It was an important task, but over the years, it began to bore her. Her adventurous spirit was still there, deeply hidden within her, yearning for the moment of its release. She had returned from the exploration and planned to enjoy a well-deserved bath before helping in any way she could, to ward off those adventurous thoughts that occasionally surfaced, urging her to abandon her post and embark on an adventure just like Tindômil, her role model. However, her plan was interrupted when she was informed that the Queen was looking for her. This was likely because she was the only one who had been in contact with Legolas over the past 2 months. After all, her best friend had avoided contact with his parents, and she was the only one who still had occasional conversations with him. Something had changed, his happiness had faded, his once bright eyes overflowing with joy now dimmed like a waning star. She asked if she could help with anything, but her best friend insisted there was nothing to be done. It was clear he did not want to discuss the matter, and she respected that. So, she did the only thing she could do, be with him and offer silent support. Her walk came to an end as she entered the royal quarters. Here, the hallways harmonized with nature, adorned with trees and flowers, and a sweet fragrance permeated the place. The walls that upheld the structure told the story of the wood elves, their sacrifices, victories, and the shadows they endured after the founding of their kingdom. She had been allowed to come here only a few times, but each opportunity was used to admire the beauty of the place and the history painted and etched in stone. She stopped for a moment to admire the imposing painting of King Thranduil, who stood with his sword alongside other elves, facing what was represented as orcs. Below it was an inscription in Elvish. Thranduil, son of Orifer, took leadership after his father's death in the Battle of Dagorlad during the War of the Last Alliance against Sauron at the end of the Second Age. In the second image, King Thranduil is shown leading an elven pilgrimage, with the lonely mountain in its splendor in the distance. Below it, another inscription narrates the events. King Thranduil moved his residence to the north of the forest, near the lonely mountain, where he established his realm in grand subterranean halls inspired by Menigreth, the ancient abode of the elves in Doriath. Tauriel was fascinated. No matter how many times she read it, it was astonishing that the arrogant and stubborn king of his time had been a brave elf who led his people to settle in the Greenwood, now known as Mirkwood due to Sauron's malevolent influence. This thought led her to examine the third painting. The scene depicted King Thranduil leading elven soldiers, confronting a horde of spiders and other evil creatures. Part of the landscape, originally green, was darkened, symbolizing Sauron's corruption. Beside this depiction, another inscription was visible. During the Third Age, the forest once called Greenwood became the now known Mirkwood due to the growing influence of Sauron, who took residence in Dol Guldur, a fortress in the southern part of the forest. This shadow brought darkness, evil creatures, and a constant atmosphere of danger. King Thranduil and his elves bravely resisted, maintaining peace in the northern part of the forest despite the growing threats. Tauriel was lost in contemplation of the painting. This was the beginning of their ongoing battle against the dark creatures inhabiting the forest. These creatures were extremely troublesome, they had to frequently explore the forest, otherwise, the spiders would come ever closer to the kingdom, endangering the well-being of the other elves. She focused her attention on her favorite depiction. In it, an elf held a silver-white sword aloft, glowing with a white light. Behind her stood the imposing figure of King Thranduil, surrounded by numerous elves, all with expressions of determination and bravery. The elf in the painting seemed to protect them, facing a fearsome red dragon whose fury and power were depicted with unsettling realism. She knew this dragon well, the fearsome Smaug. Beneath the painting was a text complementing the image. When the shadow of the dragon covered the sky and unleashed its fury upon the elven kingdom, the adventurer Tindômil, wielding her silver-white sword, stepped between the sylvan elves and the wrath of the fearsome Smaug. Her light shone like a beacon in the night, and her courage inspired all who saw her. For every onslaught of the dragon, Tindômil responded with unyielding strength, her figure shining like a star in the gloom. King Thranduil, inspired by Tindômil's bravery, joined the fight with his army, their bows and swords forming a barrier that kept Smaug from advancing further into the forest. It was fascinating, no matter how many times she saw it, her radiant figure had faced the fearsome Smaug and managed to drive him back. The battle was so intense that it changed parts of the ecosystem. Many hills were erased by the fight, and in the end, Smaug fled and took refuge in Erebor. Tindômil wanted to end his life, but Smaug had already sealed all the entrances. She still remembered how she used to be annoyed by Smaug's cowardice in fleeing. When she asked what would happen if the dragon returned, Tindômil only smiled and said something she still remembered to this day. Flashback. Lady Tindômil, what will happen if the dragon comes out again? Asked a small Tauriel, her chubby cheeks and tiny figure showing how charming she was, evident from the fact that Tindamil held her on her lap, hugging her and resting her chin on her head. Well, if that happens, I will return and face him again. But if I don't come back, perhaps my future son or daughter will deal with him, she said, laughing lightly, a laugh that charmed anyone who heard it. Tauriel was clearly captivated by that laughter. In that case, if your son or daughter comes, I will help them, and together we will fight Smaug, added an excited Tauriel, looking up to meet Tindamil's affectionate gaze. In that case, I hope you take care of them if I'm not there with him or her, she said almost in a whisper. She had once visited Galadriel, who had allowed her to see the mirror of Galadriel. There, she saw a possible future where her child fought against Smaug. The blurred figure did not reveal their gender or appearance, but she knew it was her child because of the immense love she felt upon seeing that figure, the maternal love her mother had once spoken of. She even glimpsed an elf, clearly Tauriel, helping her child. Later, she saw them both fighting a Balrog, which alarmed her greatly. A Balrog was no ordinary foe, they were extremely lethal, and she had nearly died at the hands of one of the few remaining ones hidden in Middle-earth. Lady Tindamil, can I go on adventures with you? Asked Tauriel, pulling Tindamil out of her thoughts. With a gentle smile, she stroked Tauriel's hair with great tenderness. I'm sorry, little one, but my adventures are very dangerous, she said tactfully to avoid upsetting the little girl, but she still failed, as Tauriel lowered her head sadly. Seeing the little elf's sadness, she said something more to cheer her up. Let's do this, when you're older, I'll come back and take you with me on my adventures. This clearly encouraged Tauriel, who brightened up upon hearing her role model's words. She nodded energetically and turned to look at her. I'll wait for you, Lady Tindamil, she said excitedly. Then it's a promise, she said as she embraced Tauriel warmly. I hope my child is as sweet as you, she murmured, closing her eyes and enjoying the relaxing atmosphere that surrounded her. Present. She sighed, she had already spent too much time reminiscing and reading the paintings. She needed to reach the Queen's chamber. Just as she turned around, she was startled to find the Queen standing in front of her, looking at her with great affection. I figured you would be here, after all, you took quite a while to come, said Tolvin, moving gracefully to stand by her side, admiring the paintings. I'm very sorry, Lady Tolvin, it was my negligence to be so absorbed in admiring the paintings, she said, lowering her head in apology. It was unlike her to be late, and she reproached herself for making the Queen wait. It's all right. But now that we're here, why don't we take a walk? Tolvin looked at her fondly. She didn't mind waiting, after all, Tauriel was like a daughter to her. Since Lady Goldberry had entrusted her to her care, she had treated Tauriel as her own child. She only knew who Tauriel's father was, she had no knowledge of who her mother was and why she was in Goldenberry's care for a while, but she didn't care, she had raised her, so she was her adoptive mother. Nodding, Tauriel straightened up and walked beside her. They began to walk together as Lady Tolvin spoke to her from time to time about the paintings further inside. These paintings depicted her meeting and subsequent marriage to Thranduil, as well as the birth of their son, Legolas. They went on like this for a few minutes until they came to a small garden adorned with countless roses of various colors. A fountain in the center highlighted its beauty, and next to it, a small dome complemented the garden, providing a quiet place for conversation. They both sat down. On the table was fresh fruit, clearly prepared in advance. Tolvin gently picked up a grape and lifted it to her mouth, savoring its flavor and juiciness. There was a comfortable silence, broken by Tolvin, who initiated the conversation. How is my son? She asked, a hint of sadness in her voice. Since her talk with Legolas, she had not seen him, he had been avoiding her. She understood that he needed time to take it all in and she was willing to give it to him, after all, a few months was nothing in an elf's life. He's fine, but... Tauriel hesitated, but the Queen's encouraging look prompted her to continue. But he is not the same. I see a lot of sadness in his eyes. When he comes back from seeing the human woman, his sadness increases. I don't know how to help him, she said, lowering her head in disappointment. Sensing Tauriel's mood, Tolvin reached out and gently stroked her head, a gesture she had not done in many years. Don't worry, it's not your fault. Give it a little time and it will get better, she said with a hint of sadness in her voice. Besides, you can call me mother when we're alone. I've raised you as my own daughter, so don't be so formal with me, dear. Feeling even more embarrassed, Tauriel kept her head bowed until she finally looked up and said, "I'm sorry, mother." This brought a bright smile to Tolvan's face, who nodded with satisfaction. Still feeling somewhat embarrassed, Tauriel added, wanting to understand why Legolas' mood had changed so suddenly, "Mother, can you tell me, why Legolas is like this?" "Love," sighed Tolvan, resting her delicate hand on his cheek. She had never spoken to Tauriel of that feeling. After all, given Tauriel's behavior, it seemed impossible for her to find love, so Tolvan had not mentioned it. But if Legolas had found love with a human, Tauriel, despite her strict nature, might find love as well. "Love," Tauriel murmured. She remembered hearing King Thranduil say that he would not allow his son to love a human because their short lives would eventually harm his son. "What is love? Will I ever feel that love?" she asked curiously. She wanted an explanation, thinking that perhaps understanding it might help her understand what Legolas was going through. "Yes, my dear, you might feel love in the future. Perhaps someday a man will come along and evoke those feelings in you," Tolvan said warmly. She did not know who might win the heart of her beloved adopted daughter, but she hoped it would be a just man, with no malice in his heart, and above all, a brave man. "Run, you fat bastards!" shouted Aldril in panic, fearing that Beor would catch up with them. Behind them, the dwarves gasped and ran with all their might, the huge bear in close pursuit. "Hello, this time I come as a common human. I didn't upload a chapter because I've been in a very low mood. The girl I was going to propose to turned out to be a bad woman. It's sad, and at the same time I was a bit relieved to have found out before I proposed to her. I took these days off, besides I celebrated the independence of my country like never before to try to alleviate my inner sadness." Chapter 56, Close. General POV. Expedition Team. In the distance, 16 figures could be seen running across an open field. Among these figures, 2 men stood out. In the arms of one of them hung a small figure looking back in panic. Behind these men, 13 small figures were running, gripped by fear, as a huge bear relentlessly pursued them. The brilliant moonlight illuminated the open field, revealing a cabin. This cabin was the destination of the expedition team. Moments ago, they had been discovered by the enormous bear, leaving them with no choice but to run to the cabin for refuge. "Roar!" The giant bear roared, its imposing figure clearly visible in the moonlight. It was eager to catch the figures running ahead of it. For some reason, they were very fast, perhaps due to adrenaline or something else, but the bear didn't consider this. All it wanted was to catch and maul them for daring to enter its territory. The roar seemed to spur the expedition team on, and they ran even faster. Bombur, in his panic, glanced back to see the bear gaining on them. He immediately urged his feet to run as fast as they could. Miraculously, his obese body responded, and with unusual speed for a figure like his, he managed to outpace the other dwarves, catching up with the 2 taller figures. Huff huff huff. Bombur's gasping breaths made the dwarves even more nervous. Thorin shouted, intending to motivate his men, "Hurry! Hurry!" However, Thorin's shouts weren't necessary, as the dwarves, seeing the increasingly imposing figure of the bear, ran like madmen, using every bit of energy they had left in this critical situation. All of this was being observed by a group of orcs riding wargs. They watched from a distance in the forest, led by Azog. After months of recovery, Azog still felt the pain of the new scar he had received. It was a humiliation, first from the mother, now from the son. Yes, Azog knew Aldril was Tindomeel's son, as he had the same scent, eyes and hair as her. Every time he remembered the fear he felt, his fury and desire for revenge intensified. He wouldn't stop until those filthy dwarves and that wretched woman's child were dead. A scowl formed on his face. He didn't want those bastards to die by the bear, he wanted to be the one to kill them. But those were just his desires. If Thorin's team died by the bear, the dwarves would be left leaderless and easier to eradicate. Yes, there was that red-bearded dwarf, but Azog was confident he could kill him. Tum, tum, tum. The ground trembled with each step the bear took, its enormous body causing the earth to shake, a living testament to its immense size. The expedition team felt this, sweating profusely, as if this chase would never end. The cabin seemed to recede with each step they took. But these were just hallucinations. Soon, Aldril, Gandalf, and surprisingly Bombur, were the first to reach the cabin. In front of them stood a massive wooden door secured by a chain. In his desperation, Bombur yanked at the chain, hoping to break it. Move aside! Aldril shouted, having already set Bilbo down. With a swift motion, he unsheathed his sword. Clink! The sound of the chain falling echoed as Aldril sliced through it. Quickly, Gandalf and Bombur opened the heavy door. Bilbo, being the smallest, dashed through the opening as it was being created. The other members arrived running and hurried into the cabin. Aldril and Gandalf began to close the door after the last dwarf entered. Feeling that the door was closing too slowly, everyone began to push. As the door was about to shut, the bear's head appeared in the remaining gap. Panic ensued, and they applied more force, hoping to close the door. But the bear didn't give up and exerted even more force. Seeing this, Aldril didn't wait any longer and delivered a powerful punch to the bear's snout, making it retreat. The others quickly seized the opportunity to close the door. I thought we were going to die, Keely said, collapsing on the floor near the door. Philly nodded in agreement and leaned against the door. Ah! He screamed involuntarily as the door shook from the bear's continued pounding. Bang bang bang! The pounding continued, the door and floor trembled. They were fortunate that the door was very thick, capable of withstanding such powerful blows. The dwarves held their breath, fearing that making noise might further agitate the bear. As the minutes passed, the pounding and external noises ceased. Only then did the dwarves breathe a sigh of relief and collapse on the floor. Is it gone? Ori asked, approaching the door and placing an ear against it, trying to hear if the bear was still nearby. I hope so, Nori added. Don't get too close to the door. Balin whispered urgently, pulling Ori back, fearing the bear might break through at any moment and attack them. What kind of bear is that? Thorin asked, turning to Gandalf, expecting the wizard to answer his question. Gandalf sighed in relief, sensing the bear had left. He sat on a nearby hay bale and looked at Thorin. He is the master of this place, he said, surprising the dwarves, whose faces were filled with disbelief. Aldril already knew this but still feigned surprise, raising an eyebrow. The master of this place? Keely asked incredulously, unable to imagine how a bear could live in such a place. From what he glimpsed, it looked like a place where a person would live, not a bear. Or maybe the bear is his pet, he thought. Gandalf, seeing the incredulous faces, explained, yes, this is his home. He is a skin changer, his name is Beorn. A skin changer? What's that? Bilbo asked curiously, having never heard the term before. Meanwhile, with Azog. Azog was extremely annoyed. He saw how the expedition team managed to enter the cabin, escaping the giant bear. It seemed that fate still wanted Thorin and his group alive. An orc beside him approached and asked, shall we attack them? The question earned the orc an irritated look from Azog, who, with an angry roar, said, don't be stupid, this is that bear's territory, and I doubt we can kill it with our small numbers. Turning to another orc, he gave an order, watch them. When they leave, inform me. We'll kill them on the road. At that precise moment, the sound of footsteps through a bush made him alert, fearing that another creature might emerge and attack them. But he relaxed his guard upon seeing a tall, pale, deformed orc with a metal structure covering part of his skull, riding a warg. This was his son, Bolg, whom he had left in charge of the army while he pursued the dwarves. The orc did not greet his father, it was not their custom. With a growl, he spoke loudly, I bring a message from the master. He wants you to go to Dol Guldur. This surprised Azog, who was silent for a few seconds before looking at his son. Gur, the dwarves are yours. Kill them on the road. With that said, he urged his warg to ride off and left. Chapter 57, Vision of the Future? General POV. Damn, that was way too close, Bombur said as he exhaled a sigh of relief. He was utterly exhausted, he had never run so much in his entire life. I need a smoked chop to regain some energy, he muttered, as his enormous, hefty backside hit the ground. He needed to rest a bit. Seriously? Ugh, you're thinking about food at a time like this? Dwellin asked incredulously, his hands resting on his knees, showing just how worn out he was. He probably burned all his calories during that sprint and needs to replenish them, Aldril said with an ironic smile, causing the other dwarves to burst into laughter. Bombur, in particular, patted his stomach while laughing. That's right, which is why I need you to bring out some food, Aldril, or I'll die of exhaustion, Bombur responded. He didn't mind Aldril's comment about his weight, he already considered him a friend, and among friends, it's normal to tease each other without any malice. Gandalf watched this with a smile. At some point, he had taken out his pipe, added some rolled leaves, and magically lit them. He took a puff, then blew out the smoke. His relaxed demeanor caught Thorin's attention, who couldn't understand how Gandalf could be so calm after everything they had just gone through. "Hey, Gandalf, you said the house belongs to the bear, do you know him?" Bilbo, who had been curious for a long time, finally asked. At first, he had been too nervous to speak, but Gandalf's carefree behavior put him at ease. Bilbo's question piqued everyone's interest, they were also curious about the bear. Aldril, who was in the middle of unpacking food, paused. Even though he knew who the bear was, he kept silent to avoid raising suspicion. Gandalf took another puff from his pipe as he looked at the curious eyes of the group. After a few moments, he sat down on a nearby haystack and said, "His name is Beorn. He's a skin changer, often very temperamental and territorial when he's in his bear form." Gandalf gestured for Aldril to bring some water. Aldril complied, handing him a canteen, and after taking a sip, Gandalf continued. "But when he's in his human form, you can reason with him. However..." He paused as he glanced at the dwarves before adding, "As far as I know, he doesn't like dwarves." His words made the dwarves nervous. It was unsettling to hear that it was risky to stay in the cabin. They didn't want to imagine what would happen if Beorn returned and found them, especially if he got angry and transformed into that giant bear. Gandalf noticed the nervous expressions on the dwarves' faces and could guess what they were thinking. He waved his hand dismissively, "He's probably patrolling his territory right now, he likely smelled the orcs. So there's no problem staying here, but don't touch anything, just find a place to sleep." With that, he lay down on the haystack he had been sitting on, claiming it as his bed. "Ah, whatever, I'm really tired," Boffer said, slightly relieved by Gandalf's words. Besides, now that he thought about it, what did they have to fear with Aldril and Gandalf with them? They hadn't killed the bear because Gandalf said it wouldn't be wise, so Boffer didn't care anymore. He lay down on another haystack and fell asleep instantly. The others followed Gandalf's and Boffer's lead, finding places to rest, while Bombur continued to pester Aldril for some food. With a sigh, Aldril took out some cooked legs from his ring and handed them to the delighted Bombur. This was a feature of his ring, apparently, the food was well preserved inside. He still needed to learn more about his spatial ring, but with time, he would figure it out. Aldril surveyed the area, looking for a suitable place to rest. The cabin was spacious, with plenty of scattered hay because there was a small pen with sheep and cows further ahead. "I suppose it's better to sleep on hay than on the cold ground," Aldril murmured as he lay down on a haystack near Bilbo. There was a free spot next to Bombur, but he didn't want to deal with his snoring and smelly farts. It only took a few minutes for the air to fill with snores. The dwarves had this quality, they only needed to lie down for a moment to fall asleep. Aldril stayed awake for a few more minutes, rereading the skills he had, just to pass the time. After a few more minutes, sleep finally claimed him. Bilbo waited a few moments until he was sure everyone was asleep. He carefully took out the golden ring he had picked up in the Goblin Kingdom and examined it closely. It was extremely beautiful to his eyes, truly precious. But for his fortune, the ring had not yet awakened, so he wasn't under its influence. He was simply inspecting it because it was the first time he had seen such a beautiful ring, and besides, if he put it on, he would become invisible. While Bilbo was examining the ring, Aldril was having a very strange dream. Aldril's dream. Aldril found himself on a vast and dark battlefield. He didn't know what was happening. Dwarves, elves, and humans were fighting together. The sky, once bright, was now grey, adorned with eagles and dragons battling in the air, creating a truly breathtaking sight. He looked down and saw Anglichel in his right hand, the black sword forged by Eol. Its blade emitted a dark glow, the coldness of the blade contrasting with the heat of the flames that adorned the battlefield. In the distance, a light caught his attention. There stood someone very familiar and dear to him. His mother, Tindomil, was holding Anguirel aloft, surrounded by elves. Her figure radiated with the silver-white light of Anguirel, filling him with inspiration just by seeing her. He averted his gaze from his mother, for in front of her stood Sauron. He could recognize him. The armor and height were all too familiar. Behind him, an army of orcs was preparing for battle. At that moment, a brilliant light shone in the sky, dispersing the grey clouds. The figure of a radiant ship appeared, sailing through the sky with grace and elegance. In the distance, an imposing figure loomed, covering the surrounding mountains. The ship advanced fearlessly towards the towering figure. Aldril was awestruck by these sights, but it didn't last long, as his body moved involuntarily. He gripped the hilt of Anglichel tightly, its dark light shining even brighter as a dark figure materialized before him. Its mere presence radiated evil, cruelty, and destruction. A tall being clad in dark armor stared at him fiercely. Beside this figure, a radiant being appeared, equally tall, with fists glowing with golden light. At some point, Aldril's body moved alongside the other being, both charging towards the dark figure. With a powerful leap, he clashed his sword against the dark figure's mace. It was at that moment that everything around him faded away. Something was waking him up, but before he fully awoke, a sinister, sharp voice spoke. When the stars fall from the firmament and the seas devour the land, the Son of Light shall wield the sword forged in shadows. In the last battle, the brave shall rise against the primordial darkness, and the fire of the Silmaril shall once more shine at the pinnacle of the heavens. The fate of Arda will be decided, and creation shall meet its end, or its rebirth, for this is with Bilbo. The ring was extremely precious. Bilbo had been toying with it for a long time. He glanced up slightly, inspecting the surroundings to ensure everyone was asleep. He noticed Aldril, who was breathing heavily. It was strange, but he figured Aldril was just having a bad dream. Satisfied that everyone was asleep, Bilbo carefully slipped the ring onto his finger, and to the external eye, his figure vanished. It was at that moment that Aldril suddenly opened his eyes, startling Bilbo so much that he quickly removed the ring and turned away, hoping Aldril hadn't noticed him. But a soft whisper from Aldril caught his attention. "Dager Dagorath," he heard him murmur. Curious, Bilbo turned to look at him, only to find Aldril clutching his forehead. This worried him, so he put the ring away, got up, and approached Aldril. "Are you okay?" he asked, his concern evident in his voice. Hearing him speak, Aldril looked up and frowned. "Yes, I'm fine, I just don't remember what I dreamed about," he said, his gaze distant, as if it was true that he remembered nothing. "Oh, that's normal. Sometimes I don't remember what I've dreamed either," Bilbo replied, relieved that he hadn't been caught. "If you can't sleep, we can talk," he added. He wasn't very sleepy, so talking with Aldril would be a good way to pass the time. Shaking his head slightly, Aldril looked at him and gave a grateful smile. "Thanks for worrying, but I'm really tired, Bilbo, and you should sleep too. We have a long day ahead of us tomorrow," he said before lying back down on the hay and closing his eyes. "You're right," Bilbo agreed, rubbing the back of his head. Seeing Aldril lying down, he did the same. Perhaps it was time to sleep, he could play with his ring another time. The next morning, when Aldril opened his eyes, he found all the dwarves gathered together, discussing something he couldn't quite hear. Getting up, he stretched, his bones cracking as he did so. He took some water from his ring and washed his face. He really needed a shower, as it had been a day since his last one, and he felt grimy. Calmly, he walked over to where the dwarves were. "What's going on?" he asked curiously. His question caught the attention of the dwarves, who made space for him to look through a small opening. "Look out there," Keely said nervously. Following Keely's words, Aldril leaned in and looked. Outside stood a tall, muscular figure. His bare torso reflected his chiseled muscles, and a long, black beard adorned his stern face. Aldril was surprised. This figure looked nothing like the actor from the movie. This man, who must be Beorn, looked more like a massive Viking warrior. At that moment, Gandalf approached. "Oh, it seems Beorn has returned. We're fortunate he didn't come inside and kill us," he said calmly, causing everyone to stare at him wide-eyed. "What?" Gandalf asked, puzzled by their reactions. "Anyway, Aldril, come with me. We should greet the owner of the house." With that, he moved toward a door that led to the courtyard where the giant stood. How the bear didn't enter through that door was a mystery Aldril didn't plan on solving. Something still bothered him. He knew he had a dream, but couldn't remember it. Deciding not to dwell on it further, he sighed and followed Gandalf. Chapter 58, title at the end. General POV. With the dwarves. Before Aldril woke up, the dwarves had been roused by a startled Boffer, whose shout managed to awaken most of them. Some, like Aldril and Bilbo, remained deeply asleep, oblivious to what was happening. They quickly followed Boffer, who was anxiously looking outside the cabin. For a moment, they thought it was the bear, but they were surprised to see a giant man wielding an axe, seemingly chopping wood. "Damn, who is that giant?" asked a concerned Keely. His question caught the attention of his brother Philly, who pushed past him to look outside, just as surprised. "He must have noticed us already, that's why he's swinging that axe so furiously," he said, giving the others a nervous smile. However, Balin shook his head, refuting the idea. "I don't think so. The house is enormous, I doubt he's seen us." It was logical, they were too small for anyone to notice in such a large place. But his reasoning was dismissed when Thorin approached them. "Have you forgotten? It's very likely that this is the person Gandalf told us about. His sense of smell must be quite sharp due to his transformation into a bear, so it's possible he's already sniffed us out and knows we're in his house." His serious expression conveyed the gravity of the situation. Thinking it over, Thorin was right. There was a possibility that a side effect of his transformation was adopting some bear-like traits, which could be likely given the large amount of hair covering his body. Thorin's reasoning left the dwarves in silence, exchanging nervous glances. Nori, his voice trembling, approached Thorin. "I think it would be better if we left. We could sneak out through the front door." Many nodded in agreement. They didn't want to alert the giant and risk him turning into a bear in anger over them invading his home. However, Dwalin, the grumpiest of the dwarves, grabbed him by the collar and said fiercely, spitting as he spoke, "I won't run anymore. I don't care if it's a bear or a group of orcs, I'm tired of running. If necessary, I'll stay as bait, but I won't run again." His outburst shocked Nori, who frowned in displeasure. He grabbed Dwalin's hands, and just as he was about to shout back, Gandalf's calm voice, almost magical in its effect, soothed them. "There's no need to argue. If we're still alive, it's because our gamble paid off, and without his help, I doubt we'll get very far," he said, approaching the group calmly. "You all know that the orcs are still hunting us. This open terrain won't offer us cover from the wargs. It would be very difficult to escape them without borrowing a few horses from Beorn." Gandalf's words were quite reasonable. Everyone understood that escaping without the horses would be nearly impossible, so they nodded in agreement. But that didn't stop them from feeling fear deep within their hearts. Who wouldn't be terrified of a giant capable of turning into a bear, capable of devouring you in a single bite? Nodding in satisfaction at the dwarves' acceptance, Gandalf looked at them very seriously. "Listen, we must be very polite. Try to behave as well as you can. Remember." Gesturing dramatically to the dwarves' displeasure, he raised a finger and spoke in a low voice, "He doesn't like dwarves, so mind your manners." A gulp was heard from the dwarves. Only Thorin remained resolute, with a serene face and calm demeanor. He had to show his men that, despite the danger, he remained composed. After all, that's what a king should do. "What if he doesn't like us?" Thorin asked calmly. It was the question everyone was wondering about. They hoped Gandalf would say that he'd simply throw them out and not help them, but their expectations were dashed by Gandalf's next words. "It's simple. He'd tear us apart. Everyone he didn't like is either buried in the ground or in his stomach." Gandalf's calm words left the dwarves stunned. He then glanced outside. "Oh, it seems Beorn has returned. It's a stroke of luck he didn't come in and kill us." Everyone began cursing Gandalf in their minds. How could he be so relaxed at a time like this? "What?" Gandalf asked as if what he'd said was nothing, his attitude making them sigh. During the course of their conversation, Aldril had already joined them. Not wanting to prolong the matter, Gandalf spoke to Aldril, asking him to go outside with him to greet Beorn. Just as Gandalf was about to open the back door that led to Beorn, he paused for a moment and turned to the group. "On second thought, Bilbo, you're coming too." "What? Me? Why?" Bilbo asked quickly. He didn't want to go out and face that giant. He'd rather stay here and avoid the risk of being torn apart. For the first time, the dwarves agreed with Bilbo. It wasn't that he was a coward, on the contrary, he wasn't foolish enough to take unnecessary risks. "Come on, Bilbo. You'll be with me and Gandalf." "There's nothing to fear," Aldril said calmly. He wasn't afraid of Beorn, he knew from the story that Beorn would help them. But if at any moment things went awry and Beorn attacked, he would stop him. If necessary, he would kill him, he was capable of it. After all, his abilities had been enhanced. Aldril's words seemed to reassure him, as he let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "All right, I'll feel safe with you," Bilbo said, giving a smile and relaxing his body. Hey, don't you feel safe with us? Dwellin grumbled, though he understood what Bilbo meant. Aldril and Gandalf were the strongest in the group, but he still felt offended. Gandalf sighed, turning to the others. Remember to be polite. When I give the signal, come out 2 by 2. We don't want to overwhelm him, he said before opening the door and stepping out, followed by Aldril and Bilbo. Make sure to remember that well, Aldril reminded them. He wasn't sure if the story would change, so he urged them to be polite, though his comment was mainly directed at Dwellin, who grumbled in annoyance, catching Aldril's hint. In the courtyard, Beorn was chopping wood, needing to vent his anger on something. First, some orcs had trespassed on his territory, which had greatly irritated him. Then, some foolish dwarves had taken refuge in his house. It was only natural that he felt angry. He hadn't killed them because his instincts told him it would be a bad idea. There were very dangerous people among them, probably people who didn't want to kill him and had only fled from him to avoid a confrontation. That earned them a point in his favor, allowing them to sleep in his house. His instincts began to scream at him to be cautious. He quickly turned his gaze in the direction where he sensed danger. 3 figures emerged from his house, a wizard, a human. It was strange, he also had the scent of an elf. Behind them, a small dwarf followed. So these are the dangerous ones, he thought, giving Gandalf and Aldril a quick glance. Good morning, said the wizard. His kind demeanor showed that they had come to speak with him, so there would be no fight, and for that, he was grateful he didn't want to risk dying. Half an hour later, around the enormous dining table sat the entire expedition group. The conversation with Beor had been pleasant, and he cordially accepted the dwarves once he learned they had killed the Goblin King. This king had sent raiding parties to steal his livestock, something that annoyed him greatly. Now, with the Goblin King's death, those cowardly goblins wouldn't be foolish enough to continue their raids. In the center of the table, there was a great feast: milk, bread, cheese, fruits, meat, a wide variety of foods laid out for their enjoyment, showcasing Beor's ample food resources. The dwarves, initially nervous, were now jubilant. Rarely did they have access to such a variety of foods, so without hesitation, they began devouring the meal like beasts. Gandalf and Bilbo shot them annoyed glances. Although Beor had accepted them, they should have been polite out of courtesy, but despite their displeasure, they knew that dwarves didn't show courtesy when it came to eating, so they could only express their irritation through looks. Aldril, on the other hand, was eating with elegance. He wasn't sure if it was due to his elvish blood, but ever since discovering his heritage, a deep-seated need to always demonstrate elegance had taken root within him. It likely awakened the elvish part of him. He could feel Gandalf and Bilbo's disapproving gazes directed at the dwarves, but he paid them no mind, knowing that this was simply the nature of dwarves. Beor wasn't bothered by the dwarves' lack of decorum. He understood that they were hungry. After all, they had been pursued by an orc scouting party. At first, he didn't understand why they hadn't confronted them, until he was told that the scouting party consisted of dozens of orcs mounted on wargs. While the wizard and the human might have been able to handle them all, the dwarves wouldn't have been so fortunate and would most likely have perished after some time. He noticed that the leader dwarf's mug was empty, so as a courteous gesture, he approached and struck up a small conversation while pouring more milk. So, you're the famous Thorin Oakenshield. Now I understand why you are being pursued by the orc group. Your head is highly valued by Azog, he said bluntly. Thorin, slightly surprised, looked at him and serenely took the mug, nodding his thanks before taking a sip, allowing the milk to cool his throat. How do you know Azog? He asked. With a huff, Beor set the jug aside and sat in the highest seat at the table. After all, this was his home. He once tried to enslave me, but he was foolish, and most of his men died. The coward fled as soon as I injured his eye, he said mockingly, his tone tinged with annoyance. The memory alone irritated him. That cursed orc had come shouting that he would enslave him, only to flee like a coward. So he fled from you as well, Thorin murmured with a smile. He was angry, but also somewhat pleased. It seemed Azog wasn't as strong as he appeared to be after all. He had already fled from him once, then from Aldril, and now, it seemed, from the bear as well. Are there more like you? Keely asked. Balin, feeling it was rude to ask such a question out of the blue, nudged him, causing him to hiss slightly in pain. But Beor didn't mind the direct question. He appreciated it and didn't like people beating around the bush. I don't know. I've never left here, so I'm not sure if there are others like me, he replied indifferently, taking a large gulp from his mug of milk. There was no alcoholic drink in his pantry after all, he didn't like it, he preferred the fresh milk his cows produced. Another difference from the film, thought Aldril. It no longer surprised him, it was likely that these plots were a mix of both the book and the films. However, it was a shame he'd never read the books. I imagine you want to return to Erebor, Beor said, directing a look at Thorin, who nodded in affirmation. That's right, Thorin confirmed. Precisely why we must reach it before Durin's day, added Gandalf, puffing on his pipe. You still have time, Beor continued. I suggest you rest in my home. Take your time to recover your strength. His proposal was met with a silent look from the dwarves, they didn't understand how this man, who had previously wanted to devour them while in bear form, was now offering them rest in his home. We'll accept your offer, Gandalf said with a bright smile. After all, we have to pass through Mirkwood and need to be in top condition. His words were met with unanimous agreement from the group. They concurred with Gandalf. They needed to replenish their energy, one night's sleep wouldn't have them fully recovered. Mirkwood. Beor murmured before shaking his head. If you're going to that place, I recommend you be extremely cautious. A dark force is terrorizing that forest, dark creatures roam within it. I've heard the same. We plan to take the elf path, with luck, it will be safer, Gandalf said, sharing his plan. There was nothing wrong with telling him. Safer. With a derisive huff, Beor gave him a mocking look. Those elves have withdrawn to the deepest parts of the forest. I doubt you'll find a safe path halfway through. He then rose slowly from his chair. When you've regained your strength, I'll assist you. The orcs will continue to pursue you, so to hasten your journey, I'll lend you my horses. This was met with a unanimous nod from everyone, grateful for his help. Unknown location, Field of Flowers. Legolas had decided to follow his heart, there would be no problem being alone by her side, a reasonable thought, in his view. A single meeting had been enough for them to establish a close relationship, and happiness radiated from them with every encounter. Their closeness had reached such a point that it led her to that cherished corner of his father's kingdom, a vast meadow that stretched as far as the eye could see. Flowers adorned the place, a symphony of colors swaying in the gentle breeze, spreading a sweet and intoxicating aroma. He wanted to share a special moment with her, to adorn that beautiful face with a smile. This is a wonderful place, Legolas, she said, smiling as she ran across the vast meadow, spreading her arms and closing her eyes as she spun in circles. He watched her with palpable love, her gentle smile illuminating every corner of his being. To him, she was more than just a companion, she was his light of Rivendell, the star that shone with a unique radiance in the vastness of his existence. That woman, as small as a flower, he thought as he watched her run, enjoying the beautiful place. Like a petal adrift in the wind, Sigurd smiled radiantly. She draws me to her like the force of the earth, he continued to gaze at her with love, feeling his heart race with happiness. With a heartbeat, with a strong heartbeat. She ran towards him. Come, Legolas, she said, taking his hands. Felt her soft touch. My heart fell from the sky to the earth in a dizzying movement, he observed her face, radiant with joy. My first love. I wrote this chapter with much affection for our dear Legolas, he may not be able to have a child with Bard's daughter, but heir will not prevent them to be together, all thanks to our dear Aldril haha. Fuck those who don't like sentimentality in a relationship. Chapter 59, Next Meeting. General POV. I appreciate it, we'll rest for a few weeks before setting off, Thorin said with his usual serious demeanor. He knew Beorn was right, a single night's rest wouldn't fully restore them, and this house was safe, allowing them to rest without fear of being attacked by orcs. He doubted they were foolish enough to challenge Beorn. Very well, rest up. I'll go get more firewood, Beorn replied as he left the house, heading toward the forest. This time, he didn't transform into a bear, as his temperament changes when he does, often becoming very aggressive. He didn't want to attack them by accident. Watching Beorn leave eased the fear still brewing inside the dwarves. They were grateful for his help, but they still feared that at any moment, Beorn might transform into a bear and attack them. Damn it, I can't eat peacefully with that giant nearby, Bomber said as he began devouring the food laid out on the table. The other dwarves nodded in agreement, for some reason, the giant's presence made them uncomfortable, especially after Gandalf had mentioned that he didn't like dwarves. Yes, we'd better eat well while he's gone, added Gloin, stuffing himself with lamb legs, ignoring the fruit and vegetables available. He preferred meat, he wasn't some foolish elf who ate plants. I hate milk. Don't we have any wine? Dwellin complained in frustration. He didn't like milk, this meat feast should be accompanied by wine, not milk. Clearly, all the dwarves began venting what they had kept bottled up. They hadn't spoken out of fear, but now that the giant was gone, they could let loose with their curses and foul words. With a sigh, Gandalf leaned back in his chair, took out his pipe, and took a puff. These dwarves were too noisy. Fortunately, Beorn had already gone far enough away not to hear the dwarves' comments. What a long journey, he murmured. Very few times in his life had he travelled with dwarves, but without a doubt, this was the most annoying of all. These dwarves, in particular, were very noisy, rude and ill-mannered. Bilbo felt the same, his small body slumped into the enormous chair. Fortunately, he had finished eating, otherwise, his appetite would have vanished at the sight of the dwarves eating like animals. They had no table manners, which was very bothersome, yet it didn't stop him from appreciating the cheerful atmosphere that was starting to take shape. They might be rude and without manners, but without a doubt, they were very good friends who would fight alongside you to the death. Hey Aldril, do you have any wine in your ring? If so, bring it out, I hate milk when eating meat, Gloin shouted while still chewing, causing food to spray from his mouth and splatter the beards of the nearby dwarves. This scene made Bilbo grimace in disgust, shaking himself with revulsion. Aldril, who was beside him, saw this and smiled in amusement. This is all that's left, he said, pulling out 3 bottles of wine from his ring and placing them on the table. The dwarves quickly grabbed them, starting to fight over who would get a bottle. Beside him, Bilbo admired the finger where the ring was placed. It's spectacular every time I see it. It's a great help for long journeys, he said as he admired the silver color of the ring, though for him, his ring was better. It made him invisible and was gold, a bit prettier than Aldril's. Laughing softly at Bilbo's comment, Aldril shook his head in amusement. Bilbo was very expressive, it was easy to tell what he was thinking. Turning his gaze to the grey wizard, he noticed that Gandalf had his eyes closed, the pipe still in his mouth. Hey Gandalf, how long until we reach Mirkwood? He asked. Without opening his eyes, Gandalf lazily replied, if we're given horses, it'll take us a month. That was the only thing Aldril hated, the journeys were so long. But his adventurous side told him it was a wonderful experience that he should cherish. Thorin, who was the most civilized, raised an eyebrow at Gandalf's comment. Fortunately, they still had time to reach their destination, otherwise, he would have urged them to leave immediately that very day. This was one of the changes Aldril had brought about. In the original story, the group arrived just in time, but with Aldril helping them deal with orcs and other situations, their journey had been shortened. Also, for some reason, the horses didn't tire as much when near Shadowstar. Horses, Aldril murmured as he lay back, remembering Shadowstar, his precious horse. He wouldn't deny that he missed him, it felt very strange being without him. I hope you're all right, my friend, he said in a low voice, though Bilbo still heard him and looked at him sympathetically. He'll be all right, Aldril. I'm sure you'll see him again, Bilbo said, hoping to lift Aldril's spirits. I know, he replied, appreciating Bilbo's attempt to cheer him up. He knew Shadowstar would be fine, but he still couldn't help but worry about him. Dol Guldur. The air in Dol Guldur was heavy with a disturbing energy, a hum of dark magic that seemed to permeate every corner of the fortress. The shadowy towers loomed menacingly against the grey sky, and the vegetation of Mirkwood, poisoned by dark power, added an even darker touch. Azog, feared by the orcs, had arrived at the fortress after a long journey. A few months ago, his son mentioned that the master had summoned him, so he quickly departed, leaving the pursuit of the dwarves to his son. As he ventured deeper into the ruins of Dol Guldur, Azog felt the strong presence of his master. He carefully observed the fortress, or rather, the ruins of what it once was. The atmosphere was dark and eerie, with withered trees lining the paths. Even for him, it was a terrifying environment, a testament to the power his master could wield. It only took a few minutes for him to reach a circular structure, where only darkness could be seen below. At the top, a shadow began to form, and Azog immediately knelt in submission. The mere presence of his master filled him with unparalleled terror. The black shadow regarded him as if he were nothing more than an insignificant insect, a tool to be used for its purposes. The shadow noticed the fresh wounds on Azog and found traces of that elven magic capable of harming dark beings like him. The wounds were caused by the same sword. We grow in number, we grow in strength. You will lead my army, came a terrifying voice, each word laden with power. The rough voice would make any being tremble unless they had a strong will, which is why many men fell under his dominion, men of weak will. Azog, still on his knees, spoke, trying to sound as firm as possible. He couldn't show weakness before his master. What about Oakenshield? He asked. This was something that wasn't shown in the movie, where it appeared as though Azog defied Sauron's authority, which would be a very foolish thing to do, as he was an inferior being to Sauron. The war is coming. His death will come, replied the voice, even more sinister than before. Kill the half-elf. His mother is far away, do not let his power grow. The voice grew even more menacing. If another being were present who could resist his dark power, they would notice the fear in his voice. At the mention of the half-elf, Azog instinctively touched his recent scar, clenching his fist. The son of that elf, he said, still with his head bowed. A terrifying sound came from the shadow, clearly displeased by the mention of that woman. He is weak, he must die before he grows. Azog felt the immense malice but couldn't understand why his master became so agitated at the mention of that elf. Could there have been a history he didn't know about? Had his master also faced her? But that would be impossible. So it shall be, said Azog. Shortly after, the shadow of Sauron retreated into the depths, having given his command and seeing no reason to speak further with an inferior being. Watching his master leave, Azog stood up and walked out of the circular structure with calm steps. Outside, orcs awaited him. What did the master say? Asked one of the orcs, head bowed. Azog growled, annoyed by the orc's audacity, but nonetheless, he gave his order. Go, tell Balg to kill the half-elf who is with Oakenshield. With that said, Azog ventured deeper into the fortress. With Sauron. He didn't show it, but a hidden wound began to burn when that orc mentioned that woman. The wound appeared as a white line across his chest. It had been a long time since he fought that elf. Only a few years ago had he regained his physical form, but that wound inflicted by that elf had struck at his very being. That damned sword was supposed to be lost, but Azog's wound was caused by the same sword that had injured him, hence his fear. He quickly concluded that the son of that woman had managed to obtain the sword he had sought for so long. Fortunately, the half-elf still seemed weak, as his power did not yet appear strong enough to sever the essence of those he cut. Narsil had wounded his physical body, but Angwirel had harmed his essence. It was logical that he feared this sword more. He didn't bother to go personally to kill the half-elf, believing that it would be beneath him to fight with inferior beings. In his arrogance, he did not present himself to kill Aldril. Otherwise, he would have discovered that, like Tindomil, her son was blessed by Varda, the Vala whom his master Morgoth so feared. This blessing allowed him to fight on equal terms even with the One Ring on. Despite this, Sauron had managed to kill Gilgalad and inflict a dark wound on that woman. It was a shame he didn't manage to kill that human, otherwise, he would have slain 2 of the 3 who defeated him. Mirkwood. He's still seeing her, aren't you? Asked Tolvin to Tauriel, who nodded. They were currently in that garden where they had once talked. Lately, the Queen had been calling her very often, perhaps due to what happened with Legolas, but recently she had been talking to her about that feeling of love. With a sigh, the Queen gently placed her hand on Tauriel's cheek. Her beauty outshone every rose or flower around them, and every movement, no matter how small, was made with great elegance. Do you want me to do something about it, mother? Asked Tauriel. Tolvin shook her head. There's no need, daughter, she said while looking at her lovingly. At that very moment, another elf approached and spoke delicately. My queen, a group has been seen entering the forest. The king seeks Lady Tauriel to lead and capture these people. Tolvin nodded and turned to Tauriel. Go, daughter, and be very careful. Tauriel quickly nodded and stood up. I will, mother, she said before quickly leaving the garden to head towards her team. It was very strange for a group to be wandering through the forest. As she walked through the corridors, she felt an inexplicable nervousness, perhaps it was fate or something else, warning her that she would soon encounter that destined person. The group of dwarves. Damn it, Bomber, how can you fall asleep at a time like this? Yelled Aldril as he pulled Bomber's heavy body out of the water. Here's your chapter of the day, fellow orcs. On a side note, my mother is watching the Rings of Power, I sat down to watch the recent episode and my goodness. Galadriel kisses Elrond. Ha 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 ha, Celeborn is now a cuckold. I almost died laughing when I saw that scene, haha. Remember to support me on Patreon where there are more than 15 advanced chapters, patreon.com/MiniverCry. Chapter 60, The Encounter is Approaching. General POV. A while before the group entered the forest. It's time to leave. After these 3 weeks, we've rested more than enough, said Thorin after finishing his breakfast. The team had already rested and regained all their energy, so their stay at Beorn's house would soon come to an end. Yes, let's go. I hate drinking just milk every day. Gloin retorted with a grunt, banging the table. As always, they complained when Beorn wasn't around. Despite having spent weeks with him and experiencing his hospitality, they still had a lingering fear of him. Me too. I'm sick of milk, shouted Dwellin, slamming the table with his palms so hard that he accidentally spilled his mug of milk. This immediately silenced all the dwarves who had begun to get rowdy. Damn it! Quickly, help me clean this up, urged Dwellin fervently. He quickly grabbed his shirt and started mopping up the spilled milk, but when that wasn't enough, he used his beard in a crude attempt to soak up the milk. Seeing that no one was helping, he raised his head and angrily shouted, "Help me, you idiots!" Haha, who are you calling an idiot? Gloin, who had been laughing mockingly, stopped his laughter at the word idiot, feeling it was directed at him, especially since he was right next to Dwellin. Soon enough, they began to fight, ignoring the milk still spilled on the table. With a helpless sigh, Gandalf tapped his staff, and the spilled milk instantly vanished. However, Gloin and Dwellin didn't care, they kept arguing. What a bother, Gandalf said, shaking his head. No matter how long he had been with them, they always found a way to irritate him. He had to give them credit for that throughout his long life, few had managed to annoy him as much as these dwarves. They could boast that they were among the few who had managed to irritate a wizard, and better yet, one as renowned as Gandalf. Phew, you'll have to teach me that cleaning spell, said Aldril, always impressed by the magic Gandalf used from time to time. It was very practical and also lethal when needed. Moreover, Gandalf's cleaning spell was extremely useful for long journeys, as it could also be applied to oneself, which is why Aldril had never seen him bathe and why Gandalf always had that lavender scent. There was one occasion when Aldril and the other members of the company were bathing in a river, and Keely shouted to Gandalf to see if he would join them. Predictably, Gandalf declined. Philly, being the most shameless, asked if Gandalf ever bathed at all. This was a question that everyone had wondered about but hadn't asked out of respect. Gandalf's only response was a snort, followed by a tap of his staff, which instantly left his body clean. He gave them a mocking look before lying down under a tree and smoking his pipe. That left them speechless. From that moment on, Aldril had been persistent in asking Gandalf to teach him that spell, but Gandalf always found a way to delay it, as he did now. When we finish the journey and have time, I can teach it to you, he replied. That magic is very practical. I can already imagine how quick it would be to clean my house, murmured Bilbo. Like Aldril, he was very intrigued by the cleaning spell. But it was unfortunate when he asked Gandalf if he could teach him, only to receive a negative answer, as Gandalf mentioned that Bilbo didn't have the capacity to perform magic. Soon, the fight between Dwellin and Gloin escalated to the point where it involved the other dwarves. Everyone quickly began hurling insults at each other, only to stop when a furious Thorin stood up. Enough! This immediately caused an awkward silence. Thorin, not wanting any more interruptions, turned to Gandalf, who still had that same indifferent attitude while puffing on his pipe. It was truly rare not to see him smoking for a day. Aldril always wondered if being a wizard granted immunity to lung cancer, or rather, if such diseases even existed in Middle-earth. Gandalf, how long will it take us to reach Mirkwood? He asked, beginning to realize that this wizard was very useful when it came to making decisions. After all, Gandalf had saved them from many situations, but Thorin was too proud to say it out loud. Taking a puff from his pipe, Gandalf thought for a few seconds. Approximately half a month to a month on horseback. We'll need to resupply, we'll just have to wait for Beorn to return to ask for his help. All right, Aldril, get everyone's things together. It'll be more useful if you store the food than their luggage, said Thorin, turning to Aldril, who lazily nodded. He didn't mind carrying the others' luggage in his ring, after all, it made the journey faster, and they would arrive more quickly. Besides, he was a kind person and would only get upset if someone took advantage of his kindness. Fortunately, the dwarves weren't foolish enough to do that. This was evident when Aldril kicked Bomber's backside after he tried to take the ring to grab some food. The idiot could barely walk afterward, but fortunately, Gandalf helped him heal faster. Since then, the dwarves had realized that beneath Aldril's kind smile lay a hidden beast. 1 hour later. We need dried food, milk, and we'd appreciate it if you could provide us with some horses, said Gandalf to Beorn, who nodded at his request. Very well, give me a moment. The horses are in the yard, and there are saddles in the house. Prepare them while I take care of the food and drink, he replied. Turning around, he went into his house, heading straight for his storehouse. He felt relieved that they were finally leaving, those blasted dwarves ate like pigs. Luckily, he was a frequent hunter and had plenty of food stored. You heard him, go get the saddles, said Gandalf, glancing at the dwarves and gesturing for them to hurry up. Finally, we're leaving this place. I'm not drinking another damn drop of milk, muttered Gloin under his breath so no one would hear. However, Aldril and Bilbo, who were walking beside him, overheard and both let out a small chuckle. What are you laughing at? Gloin snapped, alternating his glare between Aldril and Bilbo. Don't take it that way, Gloin. Maybe the milk will help you grow, Aldril joked, causing the dwarves walking behind them to laugh. Hey Bilbo, you're the last one who should be laughing, you're smaller than us. Unable to respond to Aldril's teasing, Gloin sought someone to vent his frustration on and found his target when he saw Bilbo covering his mouth to stifle his laughter. I'm a hobbit, it's natural to be small, Bilbo replied unfazed. Perhaps earlier, he would have kept quiet, but now his character was tougher, and he wasn't afraid to respond to the dwarves' teasing or insults. This strengthened his friendship with the dwarves. 1 hour later. The members of the expedition were ready to depart. Everyone was mounted on horses, which only carried each rider's luggage. The food had been stored in Aldril's magic ring, allowing the horses to travel light. It was also surprising that, despite his small size, Bilbo was riding a horse. Perhaps his newfound courage made him unafraid of horseback riding, though it didn't change the fact that his small figure on a horse was amusing to see. A little distance away, Gandalf was saying farewell to Beorn, thanking him for his hospitality. Thorin stood beside him, also expressing his gratitude in few words. Before you enter Mirkwood, release the horses. They're smart and will return to my home, said Beorn, resting his axe on his shoulder, giving him a very imposing look, at least, that's what the dwarves thought. Of course, we thank you for your help, Gandalf replied with a friendly smile. He was genuinely grateful for the hospitality and had to reconsider his perception of Beorn, who was very hospitable in his human form. As Aldril waited, he noticed a strange kind of bat in the distance. He quickly focused his vision, its peculiar appearance made it a hideous creature, its dark skin and the membrane of its wings were truly repulsive. He remembered seeing something like it in the film. We're being watched, he murmured. He wasn't the only one to notice, Gandalf also looked up as if sensing something, his face wrinkling in concern. Beorn, standing beside him, also glanced in the distance, catching sight of the ugly creature out of the corner of his eye. I fear you're being observed. It would be best if you left, Beorn said, waving goodbye to Gandalf and Thorin, who immediately rode off to join the group. We must hurry, Gandalf said. Aldril, do you think you can take it down? At his question, Aldril smiled and drew his bow. If you give me a hand, the distance won't be a problem. With a grin, Gandalf placed his staff against the arrow Aldril had knocked in his bow. Instantly, a bluish light illuminated the arrow, surprising everyone present. Aldril, on the other hand, focused his vision, tightened the string. Shiz! The arrow flew uninterrupted by the wind, accelerating rapidly like a predator chasing its prey. Within seconds, the arrow pierced the creature's body, causing it to let out a screech before falling dead. Very well, Aldril nodded contentedly, glancing at Gandalf with a smile. We make a good team. His words caused Gandalf to shake his head in amusement. It had been a long time since he had had a companion with whom he complimented so well. Undoubtedly, this young man had brought many surprises. All the others were silent at the action, until Keely broke it with a cry of surprise, damn! How did you do that? Gandalf, next time it's my turn. Like a little child he rode alongside Gandalf and insisted repeatedly, Gandalf on the other hand could only sigh. Yes, we'd better get going. This will give us a few weeks' head start, he said with a casual wave of his hand. Everyone quickly recovered from their surprise and, with serious expressions, nodded in agreement. There was no need for explanation, they all suspected that this creature was connected to the orcs, so it was wise to leave before its absence was noticed. With a command, their horses moved forward at a brisk pace, gradually putting more distance between themselves and Beorn's house. Beorn, still staring at the spot where Aldril had shot his arrow, muttered to himself, "My instincts were right, those two are far too dangerous," before shaking off his daze and heading back inside.
Thanks for listening.